He threw the papers across the table before Eliza had even set down her bag. Sign them. Caleb Whitmore didn't look at her when he said it. He stood at the window with his back turned, staring out at the dead grass and the broken fence line that stretched halfway to nowhere. The marriage certificate was still warm from the courthouse. The ink hadn't dried on one document before he was already pushing another across the table. A financial disclosure, a liability waiver, something with a lawyer's seal at the bottom that Eliza didn't have time to read. "You're here because my father arranged it," he said, "not because I wanted you." The room went quiet except for the wind pressing against the walls. Eliza looked at the papers. Then she looked at the back of his head, and she did not sign them. Gotcha. If someone had told you on your wedding day that your husband's first words to you would be a dismissal, would you have walked out the door, or would you have stayed to find out why a man that angry was also that afraid? That question will follow you through every minute of this story. If you're watching this for the first time, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on your notifications, because the stories we tell on this channel don't let you go easily. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Eliza Monroe, on the worst and most important day of her life. The Whitmore Ranch sat 12 miles outside of Larkspur, Montana, at the end of a dirt road that the county had stopped maintaining 3 years prior. It wasn't the kind of place that appeared on any map worth reading. The nearest town had one general store, one bar, and a post office that closed at noon on Fridays. The ranch itself had once been something. Old photographs nailed to the kitchen wall showed cattle by the hundreds, men on horseback moving across a landscape that looked almost prosperous. Those photographs were the most optimistic things on the property. Everything else was in decline. Eliza Monroe had known none of this before she arrived. What she'd known was the letter. 2 pages written in the careful, measured hand of Harold Whitmore, Caleb's father, who had placed a marriage advertisement through a broker in Billings and selected Eliza from a pool of 12 respondents. She had answered the advertisement not out of desperation, exactly, but out of a particular kind of exhaustion with the life she'd been living. A rented room above a laundry in Billings, bookkeeping work that paid almost enough, and a future that felt like a corridor with all its doors already closed. Harold's letter had described the ranch in careful, neutral language. Working cattle operation, established family property. Son requires a capable partner. He had not used the word struggling. He had not used the word failing. But Eliza was a bookkeeper. She knew how to read what wasn't written down. She had come anyway. Harold Whitmore died of a heart attack 4 days before the wedding. She had met Caleb for the first time at the courthouse, 40 minutes before the ceremony. I was tall, dark-haired, weathered in the way that men who work outdoors get weathered before they're 40. Not old exactly, but used. He had shaken her hand with the grip of someone completing a transaction and looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he can't afford to pay. She had seen that look before. From other people. For other reasons. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, thick-waisted, built in a way that Montana ranch culture had very specific and unflattering opinions about. She had learned, over 31 years, to absorb that kind of assessment without flinching. She absorbed it now. The ceremony took 11 minutes, and then he threw the papers across the table. "I'm not signing anything tonight," Eliza said. Caleb finally turned around. Whatever he'd expected her to say, that wasn't it. His jaw worked for a moment, like he was chewing on his next sentence before he decided to spit it out. "It's a standard financial separation document. Protects both parties." "I know what it is." She pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down without being invited. "I'd like a few days to review it with my own counsel before I sign." "You have counsel?" "I have a cousin who passed the bar in Missoula." She didn't, but she needed him to think she might. "Is that a problem?" He stared at her. The kitchen around them was a disaster. Dishes in the sink, a pile of unopened mail on the counter, a coffee can with a cracked lid sitting on top of the refrigerator like someone had put it there temporarily 6 months ago and forgotten about it. Eliza filed all of this away without appearing to look at any of it. "Fine," Caleb said. He picked up the papers and folded them and put them in his shirt pocket. "Your room is the second door on the left. The hot water runs cold after about 4 minutes, so don't waste it." He walked toward the back door. "I'm up at 5. I don't expect you to be." The door closed behind him. Not a slam, just a firm, final click. Eliza sat alone in the kitchen of her new home and listened to the silence of the Montana night pressing in through the walls. Somewhere outside, a cow was making a sound that didn't seem quite right. Low and labored, not the ordinary lowing of settled livestock. She wasn't sure how she knew the difference. She just did. She got up and looked out the window. There were 3 ranch hands visible in the far field, and they were all standing still, watching something on the ground. She put on her coat before she thought about it. The field was dark, and the ground was uneven, and she turned her ankle twice getting to where the men were standing, but she didn't stop. When she reached them, she could see what they were looking at. A cow on her side, breathing hard, legs moving weakly in the dirt. A calf half delivered and stuck. "Somebody needs to go get Caleb," one of the men said. He was young, maybe 22, with a hat pulled low over his face. He was talking to the man next to him, and not to Eliza, even though she was standing right there. "Where is he?" she asked. The young one looked at her then, startled, like he hadn't expected her to speak. "Up at the equipment barn." "How long has she been like this?" He looked at the other men. "Maybe 40 minutes? We called it in, but nobody—" Eliza was already kneeling in the dirt. She had grown up on her uncle's farm outside of Great Falls until she was 12 years old, and she had watched enough difficult deliveries to know what she was looking at. She didn't know if she could do anything useful, but she knew that 40 minutes was already too long, and waiting for Caleb to walk down from the equipment barn might be the difference between 2 animals and 1. "Get me a rope," she said. "Something clean if you have it." "Ma'am, you don't want to—" "I want a rope. Do you have one?" The young one had one. He handed it to her. What followed was not graceful. It was not the kind of thing that looks heroic in the retelling. It was messy and exhausting, and twice she thought she'd made it worse. And at one point the cow lurched and caught her with a hoof across the forearm, and she made a sound she was not proud of. But she kept her hands where they needed to be, and she kept talking to the animal in a low, steady voice that she borrowed from a memory of her uncle doing the same thing in a barn 20 years ago. And after what felt like a very long time, the calf came into the world in a rush and lay in the dirt and didn't move for 3 terrible seconds. Then it moved. One of the older ranch hands made a sound that was almost a laugh, surprised out of him. Eliza sat back on her heels in the mud and looked at the calf and felt something shift behind her ribs that she couldn't quite name. "Well," said a voice behind her. She turned. Caleb was standing at the edge of the field with a lantern. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His expression was entirely unreadable. She stood up. Her coat was ruined. Her forearm was going to bruise badly. Her boots were a disaster. "Rope saved the calf," she said, which was not quite true, but it gave the young hand something to feel good about. Caleb said nothing. He looked at the calf. He looked at the cow, who was recovering. He looked at Eliza. He turned and walked back toward the house without a word. By the time she found out how bad the ranch's finances were, she'd been there 9 days. She hadn't asked to see the books. She hadn't suggested it, hadn't hinted at it, hadn't done anything to indicate that she had any interest in anything beyond learning the rhythms of the household and staying out of Caleb's way. She cooked. She cleaned up. Not ostentatiously, not in a way designed to make a point, but because the kitchen was a hazard and she needed to use it. She fixed a hinge on the back door that had been banging in the wind for what looked like several weeks based on the wear pattern on the frame. She listened. She was good at listening. On the 9th day, she found a box of unopened mail behind the coffee can on top of the refrigerator. She put it on the kitchen table. She was going to leave it there as a neutral indication that she'd found it and someone should deal with it. Then she looked at the return addresses. 3 different banks. The county assessor's office. Something from the Montana Department of Revenue. A law firm in Billings she didn't recognize. She sat down. When Caleb came in for lunch, he came in every day at noon exactly, a habit so fixed it seemed less like a choice than a compulsion. He stopped when he saw her at the table with the box in front of her. "Those aren't yours," he said. "They're not opened," she said. "But Caleb, how long have you been not opening your mail?" Something moved across his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not anger. She'd seen plenty of anger. Something older and worse. Something that looked, around the edges, like shame. "I manage the ranch finances myself," he said. "When did you last pay the property tax bill?" The silence that followed answered the question. The picture that emerged over the next 3 days, because she asked, carefully and persistently, and because at some point he stopped refusing to answer, was worse than she'd suspected from the mail. Harold Whitmore had borrowed against the property twice in the last 4 years of his life, taking loans that made sense if cattle prices held and the herd stayed healthy, and made no sense at all when cattle prices dropped 15% and a respiratory illness moved through the herd the winter before last and killed 63 animals. There were 2 liens on the property. There was a payment 18 months overdue to a feed supplier named Gus Pelletier, who had, based on the increasingly terse letters in the box, been personally patient for longer than a man in his position needed to be. The property tax situation was recoverable, but only if addressed in the next 6 weeks. The bank situation was a harder conversation that she didn't yet have enough information to assess. "How close is close?" she asked. "To losing the land." Caleb sat across the kitchen table from her with his hands flat on the surface, looking at a spot somewhere past her shoulder. He had the look of a man who had been carrying something so long that he'd stopped noticing the weight of it, and now that someone else could see it, he didn't know what to do with his hands. 6 months, he said. Maybe 8 if we have a good season and I can renegotiate the stockman's banknote. What's your current revenue model? He looked at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. What are you selling and to whom? She clarified. Cattle. To the processing facility in Larkspur. And the rate you're getting now, he told her. She did the math in her head. It wasn't complicated math. It was, in fact, very simple and very bleak math, and the result confirmed what the stack of letters had already suggested. The ranch, run the way it was currently being run, could not service its debt and maintain its operation simultaneously, not with current cattle prices, not with the herd at its current size, not without something changing. There's something under this land, she said. Caleb stared at her. I don't know what yet, she said, but the soil composition in the north field is wrong for the altitude, and there's a depression about 200 yards past the equipment barn that looks like it might be covering something. I want to bring in someone to look at it. The land has been in my family for 60 years, Caleb said slowly. If there was something under it, we'd know. Would you? He didn't answer. I also want to look at what livestock you're not raising, she said. Meaning what? There's a market for heritage breed sheep that's been growing for 3 years. Bison have a premium processing rate that your facility in Larkspur doesn't handle, but there are 2 that do within a day's drive. I've been reading. You've been here 9 days? I read fast. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not trying to take over anything. I'm asking you to let me help. The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he was going to refuse, that he was going to tell her, again and in different words, that she was a burden he hadn't asked for and a complication he didn't need. Instead, he said, Gus Pelletier is coming Friday to collect on what we owe him, or take 3 of the horses. Which 3? He told her. She thought for a moment. Don't let him take the bay mare. The other 2 you can negotiate on, but not her. Why? Because she's pregnant. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it. He hadn't known. His own horse, on his own property, and he hadn't noticed. The realization moved across his face like weather. I'll deal with Gus Pelletier, she said quietly, if you'll let me. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And in the economy of Caleb Whitmore's silences, she was beginning to understand that the distance between those 2 things was smaller than it looked. What? The night before Gus Pelletier came, she sat at the kitchen table until past midnight with a legal pad and a pencil, working through numbers. The ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse had started watching her with a particular quality of attention that she recognized. Not hostility, exactly, but a suspended judgment, a waiting to see. The youngest one, whose name was Danny, had started leaving his coffee mug in the sink instead of on the counter. It was a small thing. She noticed it. She heard Caleb's boots on the porch at 11:30. He stopped outside the kitchen door for a moment. She could see the shadow of his feet under the gap. And then he came in. He looked at the legal pad. He didn't say anything. I think we can get Gus to take a partial payment and a promissory note for the rest, she said. If I structure it right, it keeps the horses and buys us 4 months. He doesn't take promissory notes. He hasn't been offered the right one yet. Caleb poured himself a glass of water and stood at the sink and drank it. He was quiet for long enough that she went back to her numbers. You're not what I expected, he said finally. She kept writing. What did you expect? He didn't answer. She hadn't really thought he would. Get some sleep, she said. I need you to be the one who speaks first tomorrow. He'll respect it better coming from you. And I'll be there, she said, but it should come from you. He looked at her for a moment, just looked, like he was trying to find the angle, the play, the thing she was getting out of this. Like he didn't know what to do with a person who was simply trying to help without an ulterior reason. He set the glass in the sink. Good night, he said. Good night, Caleb. His boots went down the hall. She heard his door close. She turned back to her legal pad and kept working because the numbers weren't done yet, and Gus Pelletier was coming in the morning, and the ranch was still 6 months from ruin, and she had a great deal left to figure out. But the calf was alive, and the bay mare was still in her stall, and somewhere under the north field, she was almost sure something was waiting to be found. She pressed the pencil to the paper and did not stop. Gus Pelletier arrived at 7:50 in the morning, which was 10 minutes earlier than he'd said he would come, and Eliza suspected that was intentional. He was a broad man in his late 50s with a gray mustache that he kept too long and boots that were expensive in a way he wanted you to notice. He drove a truck that cost more than most of the equipment on the Whitmore property, and he climbed out of it slowly, the way men do when they want you to feel their arrival as a kind of pressure. He had 2 men with him, younger, quieter, there to move the horses if it came to that. Caleb met him at the fence line the way Eliza had asked him to. She stood back near the porch, close enough to hear, far enough that she wasn't the first thing Gus saw. Caleb? Gus shook his hand without warmth. Sorry about your father. It's been a while since he passed. Still, man like Harold. Gus shook his head with a performance of grief that didn't reach his eyes. Hell of a thing. You holding up? Well enough. Gus looked around the property with the casual assessment of someone who had already done his accounting and was simply confirming it. His gaze moved across the broken fence near the south pasture, the equipment barn with its missing door panel, the general state of things. He cataloged all of it without appearing to look. I came to settle up, he said. You know what the arrangement is. I know what it is. 3 horses or the balance of what's owed, 4,200. Gus said it simply, like it was the only reasonable thing in the world. Your father was a good man, and I gave this more time than I give most, but I've got a business to run, same as anybody. We're not giving you 3 horses, Caleb said. Gus's eyes moved just slightly to where Eliza was standing, then back to Caleb. That wasn't a request, son. I know it wasn't. Caleb kept his voice level. My wife has a counter-proposal. That word, wife, seemed to land on Gus in a way he hadn't expected. He looked at Eliza again, this time taking a longer look, the kind of look she'd absorbed 1,000 times. He didn't bother to hide the assessment. She walked over. Mr. Pelletier, she said, I'm Eliza. I've been going through the accounts. Is that right? It wasn't a question. We can give you $1,400 in cash today. That's every liquid dollar on this property. She handed him an envelope. He didn't take it yet. The remaining $2,800 we're offering as a promissory note at 5% over 18 months, secured against the projected yield from the north pasture rotation we're starting in the spring. Gus stared at her. Then he smiled, and the smile was the kind that men use when they want a woman to understand she's being humored. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't take notes. You took one from the Harlan operation in 2019, she said. 14 months to clear. They paid in full plus interest. The smile dropped. She hadn't known that for certain. She'd found a reference to it in a letter Harold had saved, a conversation between Harold and Gus from 3 years back in which Gus had mentioned the Harlan note in passing as evidence of his generosity. It was thin, but it was enough. Where did you? I've also been looking at the bay mare, she said, moving on before he could finish the question. She's going to foal in about 6 weeks, quarter horse and Appaloosa cross, which is a combination that's been selling well at the Billings auction. We'd be willing to offer you first right of purchase on the foal at market rate, as a gesture of good faith. Gus looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing, which was exactly what she'd told him to do. The 2 younger men by the truck were watching now. One of them had his arms crossed. The other was looking at the ground. The note would need to be witnessed, Gus said finally. I have the paperwork drafted, Eliza said. We can sign it right now at the kitchen table. Another long silence. Gus was the kind of man who made decisions but didn't like to make them in front of people. Because making them in front of people meant you could be watched deciding, and being watched deciding meant someone might notice if you decided wrong. He looked at the envelope in her hand. He looked at the property. He did his arithmetic. 5%'s not enough, he said. 7. She'd been prepared to go to 8. 6.5. He looked at her like he was trying to find her ceiling. 6.5, he said. And I want first right on the foal in writing. Both in the note, she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was hard and deliberate, the kind meant to remind you what hands were for. She shook back with the same pressure and didn't look away. They signed at the kitchen table 20 minutes later. Gus drank a cup of coffee that she poured without asking if he wanted it, because she'd learned that men like Gus were easier to manage when they had something warm in their hands. He left without the horses. His 2 men drove away looking mildly confused. Caleb stood at the window and watched the truck go. 7 years, he said without turning around. I've known Gus Pelletier 7 years. Eliza was gathering the copies of the signed note. He's not a bad man. He just doesn't expect to be surprised. He's never taken a note from anyone. He took one from the Harlan operation. How did you know that? I found a letter in your father's papers. She set Caleb's copy on the table. You should go through those boxes when you have time. There's more in there than you think. He turned from the window. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her the previous night. That same searching quality, like he was trying to figure out the geometry of something he'd previously assumed was flat. Thank you, he said. It was, she suspected, not a word he used easily. She could hear the unfamiliarity of it in his mouth, the slight friction. The note buys us 18 months if the North pasture produces, she said. That's not a solution. It's a pause. She picked up her coat from the chair. I want to walk the North field today. I want you to come with me. He came. The North field was 340 acres of land that had been used for cattle grazing in rotating cycles for as long as the Whitmore family had owned it. Harold had grazed it hard in the last few years, pushing more animals through than the land could easily support, and it showed. The grass was thin and patchy in places, and in the northwest corner a section of ground had a depression in it, not dramatic, not the kind of thing you'd notice unless you were looking, that had been there long enough that someone had built a partial fence around it and then apparently forgotten why. Eliza stood at the edge of it and looked down. The depression was roughly oval, about 30 feet across at its widest, and the soil inside it was darker than the surrounding ground, darker and slightly damp in a way that didn't match the week of dry weather they'd had. This been here long? She asked. Caleb stood beside her with his thumbs hooked in his belt. Far as I know, my father said it was just a soft spot. Old cattle trail used to run through here. What's below you to the east? He thought for a moment. Limestone shelf. Pretty common through this county. Limestone shelf with a fracture system sometimes holds water, she said. Depending on the depth, depending on the composition. I want to bring in a hydrologist. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You think there's water under this field? I think the possibility is worth $50 for a consultation. And if there's not? Then we've lost $50 and an afternoon. She crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the dark soil at the edge of the depression and felt the moisture against her skin. But I don't think there's not. He looked at the depression. He looked at her fingers in the soil. He didn't say anything for a moment. My father walked this land his whole life, he said. I know. He would have seen it. He was looking for problems, Eliza said, standing up. Sometimes you have to look for something else to find what's been there all along. Caleb said nothing. The wind moved through the dead grass around them. Somewhere behind them, one of the horses made a sound that carried across the open ground. Make the call, he said finally. The hydrologist. She nodded and didn't make a show of it. They walked back toward the house in a silence that was, she noticed, beginning to feel different from the silence of the first 9 days. Less like a closed door. More like a room she hadn't been invited into yet but wasn't being actively kept out of either. The hydrologist's name was Ruth Cantor, and she drove out from Billings on a Thursday with equipment in the back of her truck and the kind of no-nonsense manner that made Eliza like her immediately. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back tight and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. She walked the north field without talking for the better part of an hour. She took samples. She did things with a device that beeped in patterns Eliza couldn't interpret. Then she came back to where Eliza and Caleb were waiting near the fence and pushed her glasses up and said, "There's water." Caleb made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "How much water?" Eliza asked. "Significant. There's a fracture in the limestone shelf about 40 feet down that's feeding into a natural reservoir. Based on the moisture patterns and the seismic readings," she paused and looked at them both. "You're looking at a source that could sustain irrigation for 2, maybe 300 acres, possibly more depending on the draw rate." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. "This land has been in my family 60 years, Caleb said. "It's been here longer than that," Ruth said, not unkindly. "It's a good find. You'd need to drill. I can give you names of outfits that do that kind of work. And you'd need to test the quality before you do anything with it. But if it tests the way I expect it to test—" She looked out over the north field. "This changes what this land is worth." After Ruth left, Caleb stood at the fence for a long time without speaking. Eliza stood beside him and let him have the quiet. 300 acres of irrigated land," he said eventually. "Changes the math. Changes everything." He looked at her. "How did you see it? 9 days you were here." "I wasn't looking for what was wrong," she said. "I was looking for what could be right." He looked back at the field. The late afternoon light was making the dead grass look almost golden, which was the kind of trick the Montana sky pulled on you when you weren't expecting it. "Who knows about irrigation systems?" he said. "I've been reading. I can find out what I don't know." "And the funding for the well drilling, that's the next problem," she agreed, one problem at a time. The next problem turned out to be several problems stacked on top of each other. The well drilling estimate came in at $11,000, which was $11,000 they did not have and could not borrow against a property already carrying 2 liens. Eliza spent 4 nights running numbers before she arrived at an approach that she didn't love but couldn't find a better alternative to: a limited agricultural partnership, structured so that an outside investor would fund the drilling and initial irrigation infrastructure in exchange for a percentage of the revenue from any crops grown on the irrigated acreage for a period of 10 years. She knew one person who might consider it. His name was Martin Feld, and he was not a friend exactly. He was a man she had done bookkeeping for during a 3-month contract in Billings, a semi-retired investor who had made his money in livestock transport and spent his retirement looking for small agricultural plays that interested him. He was 71 years old and had the attention span of a man who had heard every pitch ever invented and been bored by most of them. She called him from the kitchen phone on a Tuesday evening while Caleb was in the equipment barn. "Eliza Monroe," Martin said. "Or is it Whitmore now?" "Whitmore," she said, which still felt strange in her mouth. "I have something I want to show you." "You're calling me from a ranch in the middle of Montana." "I am." "What does the land look like?" "Like it's been neglected for 3 years and is about to be worth something significant." A pause. "I'm listening." She laid it out for him in 12 minutes. The water find, Ruth Cantor's assessment, the irrigation potential, the plan to shift part of the operation toward high-value crops, in addition to the heritage livestock angle she was already developing. She was not a salesperson. She didn't try to be one. She gave him numbers and let him do his own arithmetic, because Martin Feld had been doing his own arithmetic for 50 years and did not need her to do it for him. 10-year revenue share is too long, he said when she finished. 7. 8, and I want quarterly reporting. 7 in annual reporting with a 6-month review option. He laughed, which was a good sign. Who taught you to negotiate? Trial and error, she said. 7 years, annual reporting, 6-month review option, he said. I'll want to see the hydrologist's report before I commit. I'll send it tomorrow. And Eliza. His voice shifted, went slightly quieter. The people in that county are going to give you trouble. You know that. I know that. Because of what you're doing, or because of what you look like? Both, she said. Probably. How's your husband about it? She considered how to answer that. He's learning. Fair enough. Send me the report. She hung up. She sat for a moment at the kitchen table in the quiet of the evening, and then she got up and went to find Caleb because there were things she needed to tell him, and she'd learned by now that he didn't like to be told things late. I took it better than she'd expected and worse than she'd hoped. The part about Martin Feld and the partnership structure, he listened to that without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was his version of engaged attention. The numbers seemed to settle something in him, the way numbers sometimes did for people who'd been frightened of them. A concrete sum, a concrete timeline, a concrete structure. These things Caleb could work with. It was the crops that set him off. "This is a cattle ranch," he said. "It's been a cattle ranch since your grandfather broke the land, I know." She kept her voice even. "And it'll still have cattle. I'm not talking about replacing what's here. I'm talking about adding what isn't." "Lavender?" He said the word like she'd suggested they start raising peacocks. "Lavender and specialty grain. There's a market for both in the Pacific Northwest that's been underserved from Montana suppliers. The margins on specialty grain with irrigation support are, this is cattle country." "Caleb." She stopped. She looked at him directly. "The cattle, at current market rates and current herd size, will not save this ranch. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's what the numbers say, and I think some part of you knows that, or you would have opened that mail a long time ago." The silence that fell was a different kind of silence, not the closed-door kind, more like the sound of something that had been held back for a long time, finally finding the crack it needed. He sat down at the table. He put his hands flat on it the way he had the night she'd first shown him the mail, and he looked at them. "My father built this place around cattle," he said. His voice was quieter now, different. "I know he did. If I turn it into something else, you're not turning it into something else. You're keeping it alive long enough that it can be something at all." She sat down across from him. "Your father made the best decisions he could with what he had and what he knew. You're allowed to make different ones." He was quiet for a long time. "The ranch hands," he said. "Danny and the others. They signed on for cattle work. Some of them will adapt, some won't. That's a harder conversation, and it's one we have later, not tonight." He looked up at her. "You've already thought about the ranch hands." "I think about everything," she said. "It's not a gift. It keeps me up at night." Something moved in his expression then. Something that wasn't quite warmth, but was in the neighborhood of it. The reluctant acknowledgement of a shared affliction. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Right now? I need you to let me send Martin Feld the hydrologist report and see if he commits. If he does, we move to the next step. If he doesn't, we figure out a different way to fund the drilling." She stood up. "Nothing changes tonight except that you know what I'm working on." He nodded, slowly, but he nodded. Martin Feld committed in 11 days. The commitment came with conditions, which she'd expected, and with a lawyer from Billings who arrived to review the partnership agreement and spent most of his time trying to ask her questions that she kept referring back to Caleb because the lawyer's name was Howard Brent. And Howard Brent was the kind of man who dealt with other men on instinct and needed to be nudged into recognizing that the woman across the table from him was the one who'd written every clause in the document he was reviewing. Caleb figured that out around the second hour and started directing Howard's questions back to Eliza himself. It was a small thing. She noticed it. The agreement was signed on a Thursday afternoon. Martin Feld wasn't there in person. He signed through his lawyer and sent a brief note that said only, "Good luck. Send me the Q1 report on time." The drilling crew arrived the following Monday. They were a 4-man operation out of Great Falls, efficient and quiet, and they set up in the northwest corner of the North Field and started work that morning. Eliza watched from the fence for the first hour and then made herself go back to the house because standing and watching things happen was not in her nature and made her feel like she was wasting time she could be using. She was in the kitchen working on the heritage livestock projections. She'd identified a breeder in Wyoming who had a small herd of Navajo churro sheep available, a breed that was gaining traction with specialty wool buyers, when Danny knocked on the back door. Danny was the youngest of the 3 full-time hands, 23 now by her estimate, and he'd been watching her for weeks with the expression of someone trying to solve a math problem he wasn't sure he had the right tools for. He held his hat in his hands when she opened the door, which meant he was either bringing bad news or asking for something. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Eliza." "Yes, ma'am." He was not going to call her Eliza yet. She'd accepted that. I wanted to let you know that Roy Becker was here this morning." She didn't know that name. "Who is Roy Becker?" "He owns the Becker Consolidated Operation, the big one, south of Larkspur." Danny turned his hat in his hands. "He was talking to Pete and Tom out by the bunkhouse. I didn't hear all of it, but what?" "He was asking about the drilling, how much it was costing, who was funding it. He was real. He was being real friendly about it, the way he is, but Danny stopped. Roy Becker's been trying to buy this land for 3 years. He made your father-in-law 2 offers before he passed. Eliza stood with her hand on the door frame and looked at Danny carefully. What did Pete and Tom tell him? I don't know. They didn't know I was listening. He paused. I just thought you should know he was here. Thank you, Danny. He put his hat back on. The drilling crew found something this morning. The foreman wanted me to tell Mr. Whitmore. They hit the first water table at 38 feet. He said to tell you that's about as shallow as he's ever seen it. She let out a slow breath. Tell the foreman we'll be out in 20 minutes. Danny nodded and went. She turned back to the kitchen and took a moment, just a moment, to press her hand flat on the counter and close her eyes and let herself feel the full weight of what 38 feet meant. What it meant for the math. What it meant for the land. What it meant for the conversation she was going to have about Roy Becker. And what Roy Becker being on this property meant for how much time they had before someone with considerably more resources than a friendly feed supplier decided that the Whitmore Ranch was worth taking by some means other than patience. She opened her eyes. She went to find Caleb. The water, when it came up, was clean. The quality test results came back the following week, and they were better than Ruth Cantor had predicted. Low mineral content, good flow rate. The kind of result that made the hydrologist call personally to say she'd been pleasantly surprised, which from Ruth Cantor was apparently the equivalent of a standing ovation. The news moved through Larkspur faster than Eliza would have liked. She'd underestimated how much attention a drilling crew attracted in a county where everyone knew which properties were struggling and which weren't, and where the Whitmore Ranch specifically had been the subject of a particular quality of public speculation since Harold's death. People had opinions about what would happen to it. Most of those opinions involved it eventually becoming part of the Becker consolidated operation, which had been quietly absorbing smaller properties in the county for the better part of a decade, always through legitimate means, always at prices that were fair enough that the sellers couldn't complain, just low enough that the sellers always felt afterward like they'd missed something. Roy Becker himself came to the house on a Saturday morning. Eliza was in the small room off the kitchen that she'd converted into an office. 2 weeks of persistent reorganization had made it functional, which Caleb had noticed without commenting, when she heard boots on the porch and then voices. She came out. Roy Becker was not what she'd pictured from Danny's description. She'd pictured someone harder, more visibly predatory. What she found was a man of about 65 with a pleasant face, and the kind of manner that had probably been genuinely agreeable once, before money had made it into a performance. I was well dressed for a Saturday ranch visit, which told her the visit wasn't casual. He was shaking Caleb's hand when she appeared. And this must be the new Mrs. Whitmore, he said, turning to her with a smile that showed too many teeth. Roy Becker, I knew your father-in-law well. Hell of a man. So I keep hearing, Eliza said, and shook his hand. He had a firm handshake, and he kept his eyes on her face while he delivered it, watching for something. She gave him nothing to find. I heard about your water find, he said, letting her hand go and pivoting back to Caleb in a way that was so smooth it was almost invisible. Congratulations. That's a genuine piece of good fortune for this property. We're pleased about it, Caleb said, as you should be. It changes your land value significantly, I'd imagine. Roy tucked his thumbs in his belt. He was doing the same casual property assessment that Gus Pelletier had done, but Roy Becker was better at hiding that he was doing it. I'll be straight with you, Caleb. I've always admired this land. I made your father 2 offers, as you may know, and he turned them down, which was his right. I'm wondering if the circumstances being what they are, you'd be open to a conversation. What kind of conversation? Caleb asked. A purchasing conversation. Roy said it pleasantly. I'd account for the water find in the offer, of course. You'd be looking at considerably more than what I put on the table for Harold. Eliza watched Caleb's face. She watched him take the offer in and weigh it, and she could see in the set of his jaw that some part of him was calculating what it would mean to be free of the debt, free of the weight of it, free to start something else somewhere without the whole machinery of a failing ranch grinding on him every day. She said nothing. She had promised herself in those first 9 days that she would never make decisions for this man. She would show him what she saw. She would work the numbers. But the land was his family's land, and this was his choice to make. And if he decided to sell it, she would find a way to live with that, and they would build something different. The silence stretched. I appreciate you coming out, Roy, Caleb said. He said it without looking at Eliza. I'm not interested in selling. Roy's pleasant expression adjusted itself slightly. The offer stands open. These things change. I expect they do, Caleb said. I'll walk you to your truck. She watched them from the porch. Roy Becker said something as they walked that she couldn't hear, something low and conversational, and Caleb listened without responding. At the truck, they shook hands again, and Roy drove away and Caleb stood in the yard for a moment before turning back toward the house. When he reached the porch, he stopped and looked at her. You didn't say anything, he said. It wasn't my place. You had something to say. Several things. She held the door open. Do you want to hear them? He came inside. What she'd wanted to say, and what she said now at the kitchen table over coffee that had gone slightly cold, was this. Roy Becker was not coming back with a better offer. That was not how Roy Becker operated. He'd come once, and the offer was fair and the visit was cordial. And if they turned it down, the next step would not be another visit. It would be something else. Pressure from another direction. A banknote called in ahead of schedule. A supplier who suddenly couldn't fill an order. A piece of county permitting that got held up longer than it should. She didn't know which one. She didn't know his specific tools, but she knew the shape of the thing. You're saying he'll come after us, Caleb said. I'm saying that men like Roy Becker don't stop. They change methods. She wrapped her hands around her mug. I want to move faster on the livestock side. If we can show a functioning, diversified operation before he can apply pressure to the infrastructure, it makes us harder to slow down. How much faster? I want to close on the churro sheep by end of next month, and I want to talk to the County Agricultural Extension Office about the specialty grain permitting before Becker has a chance to build any relationships there. Caleb looked at her. You think he'd go to the Extension Office? I think he's been in this county for 30 years, and he has relationships everywhere. We need to be visible and legitimate and moving quickly enough that there's no gap for him to fill. A pause. Danny said Becker talked to Pete and Tom the morning of the drilling, Caleb said. I know. I need to talk to Pete and Tom. That's my job. I know that too. She looked at him. But do you know what to say to them? He was quiet. Tell them the truth, she said. Tell them the ranch is rebuilding and there are going to be changes and you need to know if they're with you or not. Honest conversation now is better than finding out later that they've been talking to Becker's operation about positions. She paused. Danny is solid. The other two I'm not sure about. Tom's been with this ranch 12 years. 12 years of loyalty to your father doesn't automatically transfer, she said. Find out where he stands. Caleb nodded slowly. He didn't like it, she could tell. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right about something that should have been obvious to him and hadn't been. That particular discomfort was one she was learning to recognize on his face, the slight tightening around the jaw that meant he was adjusting his sense of what he'd missed. She didn't make more of it than it was. One more thing, she said. He looked at her. Next time Roy Becker comes, and he will come again, I'd like to be the one who talks to him. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The late afternoon had moved the light in the kitchen, and it was coming through the window sideways now, and she could see the lines in his face that the last several weeks had put there, or maybe the last several years. It was hard to know where one ended and the other began. All right, he said. She nodded. She stood and took the mugs to the sink. Outside the kitchen window, the north field was going dark in the early evening, and somewhere under those 38 feet of Montana limestone, the water that no one had known about for 60 years was moving through the rock the way it had always been moving, quiet and patient, waiting for someone to think to look. She turned on the tap to rinse the mugs and thought about Roy Becker, and she thought about the sheep broker in Wyoming, and she thought about Pete and Tom in the bunkhouse, and she thought about all the things that were about to accelerate whether or not they were ready. She thought, ready doesn't always get to be a choice. She turned off the tap. There was still work to do before morning. The conversation with Pete happened on a Monday and with Tom on a Wednesday, and Caleb handled both of them himself, which was what Eliza had wanted. She knew because Danny told her, not directly, but in the way he talked around things, mentioning that Pete had seemed quiet at breakfast and that Tom had asked Danny what he thought about the new direction before dinner on Wednesday night. She filed all of this away and waited. Pete Garza quit on Thursday morning. He came to the house and asked to speak to Caleb, and they stood on the porch for about 10 minutes, and then Pete went back to the bunkhouse, and packed his gear and drove away in a truck with a cracked taillight that Eliza had been meaning to mention someone should fix. He was 41 years old and had worked cattle his whole life, and the idea of a ranch that also grew lavender and ran heritage sheep was, apparently, a bridge he couldn't cross. She didn't blame him. She watched his truck go and felt a complicated thing that was partly relief and partly guilt, and partly the awareness that the ranch was now down to 2 hands when it needed to be up to 5. Tom Niederer stayed. He came to the house the following morning, not to see Caleb, but to see her, which surprised her enough that she stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was polite. "I want to learn the new stuff," Tom said. He was 54, weathered and deliberate in his speech, a man who seemed to choose each word the way you'd choose a tool for whether it fit the job. "I'm not saying I understand all of it, but Pete's gone and Danny's young, and you're going to need somebody who's been here long enough to know where the bodies are buried." He paused. "Figuratively." "I understand figuratively," she said. "Come in." Tom Niederer became, over the following weeks, one of the more important things that happened to the Whitmore Ranch, though he would have been embarrassed to hear it described that way. He knew the land with the specific intimacy of someone who had walked it in every season for 12 years, where the ground went soft in the spring thaw, which fence lines were original construction and which had been repaired badly and would need to be done again, why the eastern gate stuck in cold weather, and what you had to do to it. He brought Eliza information she couldn't have read in any book, and she brought him frameworks for thinking about the operation that he absorbed with the careful attention of a man who was determined not to be left behind by a changing world. They were not friends exactly. They were something more useful than that. The Navajo Churro sheep arrived on a Tuesday in late March, 43 animals in a livestock trailer that Eliza had arranged through the Wyoming breeder, a woman named Carla Ostroff, who drove the trailer herself and spent 2 hours walking Eliza and Tom through the specific management requirements of the breed before she'd agree to leave. "They're not difficult animals," Carla said, watching the last of them move into the pasture Eliza had designated and prepared. "But they're not forgiving of neglect. They need attention, and they need the right forage, and they will absolutely tell you when something is wrong." "How do they tell you?" Eliza asked. "They get quiet." Carla looked at her. "Healthy churro sheep are loud animals. When they go quiet, you check." Eliza wrote that down. Caleb watched all of this from the fence with an expression that she'd learned to identify as his version of genuine interest, wrapped in a protective layer of skepticism. He asked Carla 2 questions, practical questions about parasite management and winter hardiness, and Carla answered them with the directness of someone who had been answering the same questions for 30 years and still thought they were good ones. By the time Carla's trailer disappeared down the road, Caleb was leaning on the fence, watching the sheep settle into the pasture with what Eliza could only describe as reluctant investment. "They're smaller than I expected," he said. "The wool market doesn't care how big they are," she said. "It cares about the fiber diameter and the character of the fleece, and on both counts, these are top of the category." "You know an awful lot about sheep for someone who wasn't a sheep person a month ago." "I wasn't a sheep person 6 weeks ago," she corrected. "I am now." He looked at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something adjacent to it. Danny was standing near the pasture gate with his arms on the top rail, watching the sheep with an expression of pure, uncomplicated fascination. He'd appointed himself responsible for learning the new operation with an enthusiasm that Eliza found both touching and practically essential. She'd given him 3 books on heritage livestock management, and he'd returned them, annotated. "What do we call them?" Danny asked. "We're not naming them," Eliza said. "I've already named 4 of them," he said, unabashed. She decided not to address that yet. The irrigation infrastructure went in over 6 weeks that spring, funded through Martin Feld's partnership capital, and executed by a crew that Eliza sourced herself after getting 2 other bids and finding them either overpriced or underexperienced. The work was loud and disruptive and dug up a significant portion of the North Field in a way that looked, for several weeks, like the aftermath of something catastrophic. Caleb walked torn-up ground every morning with the expression of a man making himself witness something difficult. She understood what it cost him to watch his father's land turned over that way, even in the service of saving it. She didn't minimize it. She just kept the schedule moving because sentiment was a thing you could afford when the bills were paid. The county agricultural extension office had been, as she'd hoped, receptive. The agent assigned to their property was a woman in her 40s named Sandra Voss, who arrived with a clipboard and left with a genuine enthusiasm for the specialty grain plan that was either professional encouragement or real belief. Eliza wasn't sure which and decided both were useful. Sandra filed the permitting paperwork in the third week of March and told Eliza to expect a 4 to 6 week review, which was faster than the standard timeline, and which Eliza suspected was partly Sandra's own efficiency, and partly the fact that she'd gotten there before Roy Becker had thought to build a relationship with the extension office that might slow things down. Roy Becker, in the meantime, had been quiet, too quiet, in her assessment. She mentioned this to Caleb in the first week of April. "Maybe he moved on," Caleb said. "He hasn't moved on. How do you know?" "Because the Becker Consolidated operation tried to hire Tom last month." Caleb put down his coffee. "What?" "Tom told me last week. He said someone called the bunkhouse line and offered him a position at double his current pay." She looked at Caleb directly. "Tom said no. But it means Becker is paying attention to our personnel. He's looking for the weakest point." Caleb was quiet for a moment. She could see the specific frustration of a man who had spent his life dealing with physical problems. A fence that needed mending, a piece of equipment that needed fixing. Now confronted with a kind that had no clear location and no obvious tool. "What do we do?" "We raise Tom's pay," she said. "And we keep moving fast enough that there's nothing for Becker to slow down." "We raise his pay. That's your solution." "It's not the only one, but it's the first one." They raised Tom's pay that afternoon. The storm came on a Friday night in the second week of May, with no meaningful warning. Montana storms in spring were not unusual, and Eliza had already been through two since arriving. One that had been loud and brief, one that had taken down a section of fencing and kept the hands busy for 2 days. She thought she had a reasonable sense of what the weather here could do. She did not have a reasonable sense. The system that came in from the northwest that Friday was the kind that the old-timers in Larkspur described later as a once-in-20 years event, though nobody had thought to warn the Whitmores about the 20-year timeline before it arrived. The wind hit first, hard enough to wake her at 2 in the morning with the sound of something structural giving way somewhere on the property. Then the rain came. Not as rain exactly, but as something between rain and a pressure system, sideways and relentless, and accompanied by hail that started at marble-sized and worked up to something larger. She was dressed and pulling on her boots before she was fully awake. Caleb was already gone from the house by the time she got downstairs. She could see the beam of his flashlight out near the equipment barn. She went to the back door and opened it, and the wind hit her so hard she had to put a hand on the frame to stay upright. She went out anyway. The next 4 hours were the worst she'd spent since arriving in Montana, and she'd had some genuinely bad hours. The irrigation infrastructure held. The new piping was underground and wasn't going anywhere. But the temporary greenhouse structure she'd had erected in the south field to start the specialty grain seedlings came apart in the wind at approximately 3:15 in the morning, which she learned when Danny appeared at her side in the darkness, shouting over the noise that the frame had gone over. The south pasture fence lost 2 full sections to a tree that came down across it, and 2 of the churro sheep were out before Tom got there to manage it, and locating them in the dark and the rain and the hail was 45 minutes of miserable searching that ended with both animals found, but Tom's jacket destroyed, and Danny taking a fall in the mud that banged up his knee badly enough that he was limping for the next week. The equipment barn lost part of its roof. Not all of it. 1 corner, maybe a quarter of the total surface, the section that had been repaired inadequately sometime in the past, and that Tom had flagged as a concern back in February. The equipment inside was partially exposed. A tractor was damaged. 2 storage units that contained supplies for the irrigation build-out were soaked through. Eliza stood in the barn at 6 in the morning with the storm finally moving east and the gray dawn coming up, and assessed what was in front of her with the specific effort of someone who has learned that the only thing panic does is cost you time. The tractor was repairable. The supplies were partially recoverable. The roof was the larger problem. It needed to be fixed before the next rain, which Sandra Voss had told her last week typically came in May on a 10 to 14-day cycle. She did math in her head that she didn't like the results of. The greenhouse seedlings were a loss. She wouldn't know how complete a loss until she could assess the frame damage. But the seedlings themselves, which had been 12 weeks of careful work and represented their first specialty grain planting, were gone. That was the hardest calculation. Not because of the money, though the money mattered, but because the timeline she'd built everything around had assumed a first grain harvest in the fall. And without those seedlings, the fall harvest became either smaller or later or both. And the revenue projections she'd given Martin Feld had been built on that timeline. She was going to have to call Martin Feld. She was also, she realized, going to have to call Ruth Cantor and confirm that the water table hadn't been affected by the kind of surface flooding that had hit the North Field overnight, because she didn't know enough yet about the hydrology to be sure, and she couldn't afford to assume. And she was going to have to do all of this while managing the barn roof, and the fence, and the equipment, and 2 ranch hands who were exhausted, and one of whom was injured. She thought, with a clarity that would have been funny if she'd had the energy for humor, this is the part where a reasonable person questions their choices. She went to find Caleb. She found him sitting on the tailgate of the work truck outside the barn with his elbows on his knees and his hands hanging between them, looking at the damaged corner of the roof. He was soaked through. He had a cut on his forearm from something she didn't ask about yet. She sat next to him on the tailgate. For a moment they were both quiet, looking at the barn, at the patchy dawn sky, at the mud that covered every surface and the branches that lay across the yard, and the places where the fence lines went wrong. "The seedlings are gone," she said. "I know. The barn roof needs to be done before the next rain." "I know that too." A pause. "How bad is it?" he asked. Not accusingly, not with the edge she'd heard in his voice in the early weeks. He was just asking. "It's bad," she said. "It's not fatal." "The greenhouse. We can replant. Later in the season than I wanted. The first harvest will be smaller than I projected." She paused. "I have to call Martin Feld and tell him the Q3 numbers are going to be lower than the agreement projected." Caleb looked down at his hands. "He'll want to renegotiate." "Maybe. Or he'll hold the terms and wait. He's that kind of investor. Or he'll pull out." "He won't pull out." She said it with more certainty than she completely felt, because this was not the moment to give Caleb an incomplete floor to stand on. Martin Feld has been an agricultural investment for 30 years. He knows what weather does. He built contingency into his thinking before he signed. Caleb was quiet. "The irrigation infrastructure is fine," she said. "The well is fine. The sheep are fine. The things we built from the ground up held. It's what was already here, the things that were already weak, that went." She paused. "That matters." He looked at her. "It matters because what we've built new is solid," she said. "This storm hit everything on this property equally, and the new things held and the old broken things didn't. That's information." He was quiet for a long time. The morning was getting brighter in that thin, washed-out way that follows bad weather, light without warmth. "I thought about selling," he said, "last night when the barn roof went. I stood there in the rain and I thought, Roy Becker would be on the phone by 8 this morning. He probably will be anyway." "Yeah." Caleb looked back at the barn. "I didn't call him." "I know." "I'm not going to." "I know that too." He looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before, or hadn't noticed. Something past the wariness and the pride and the complicated grief of a man holding on to what his father left him. Something that looked like the beginning of trust. Not complete, not settled, but started. "What do we do first?" he asked. "Barn roof," she said. "Today. Tom knows a crew in Larkspur? Hender's brothers, they're fast. Call them this morning. Get them out here as soon as they can come." She stood up from the tailgate. "Then I'm going to call Ruth Cantor and Martin Feld in that order, and then we're going to start the greenhouse frame assessment." He nodded and stood. He was taller than her by several inches, and in the early light he looked tired in a way that she suspected went back further than last night. "Eliza," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said, "for last night, for staying out in it." "Where else would I be?" He didn't answer that, but something in his expression shifted, adjusted, settled slightly. They went to work. Roy Becker called at 8:17 in the morning. He didn't call Caleb. He called the ranch line, which was the kitchen phone, and Eliza answered it because she was standing in the kitchen making coffee, and because she had told Caleb 3 weeks ago that the next time Roy Becker made contact, she wanted to be the one to handle it. "Mrs. Whitmore." Roy's voice was warm with what she'd identified as exactly, but calibrated. I heard about the storm, wanted to call and check in. That's kind of you, Mr. Becker. Call me Roy, please. I've known this property a long time. Hate to see it take a hit. A brief pause. I understand the equipment barn took some damage. He knew already. Of course he knew. A county this size, information moved before the mud dried. Nothing we can't manage, she said. Sure. Another pause, and in that pause she could feel the architecture of the conversation he was building. I imagine the timing is difficult with the infrastructure investment you've been making. These things add up. They do. I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you're a straightforward person. He said this with the tone of someone who'd prepared the line and was delivering it as though it had just occurred to him. My offer on the property stands. Given the current situation, I'd be prepared to move quickly. A cash transaction, closed in 30 days, which would resolve the debt position and give you and Caleb a clean start somewhere without all of... He let the implication settle where it wanted to land. Without all of this. Liza held the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the north field where the irrigation lines ran underground and the water table sat 38 feet down and the sheep were grazing in the wet grass like nothing had happened. I appreciate you calling, Roy, she said. I do, but we're not selling. A very brief pause. The offer won't go up, he said, and for just a moment the pleasant calibration slipped slightly and something harder showed through. I want you to understand that. I understand, she said, but the answer is the same. Silence. Well, he said, recovering the pleasantness, you know where to find me. We do, she said. Thank you for calling. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about what he'd said. I want you to understand that. The offer won't go up. It was the statement of a man who was closing off the easy option before he moved to the harder one, and she needed to understand exactly what the harder option was going to look like before it arrived. She picked up the phone again and called Ruth Cantor. Ruth's assessment of the water table, delivered by phone and confirmed by a site visit 2 days later, was that the storm had, if anything, improved their situation. The surface flooding had percolated into the limestone fracture system and increased the reservoir volume slightly. The water was fine. The well was fine. Martin Feld, when she reached him, was exactly what she'd told Caleb he would be. Weather's weather, Martin said. What's the revised projection? She gave him the numbers. The first harvest would be reduced. The Q3 revenue would come in below the partnership agreement projection by approximately 30%. The Q4 and following year projections were unchanged. You're telling me this now, he said, day after the storm. Good. A pause. What do you need? Nothing from you right now. I wanted you to have accurate information. I like accurate information, Martin said. Most people in your position would have waited to see if they could claw back the number before reporting. I'm not most people in my position. No, he said. You're not. A brief pause. Is Becker going to make a move? She was quiet for a moment. How do you know about Becker? I do research before I invest, Martin said. Roy Becker has been circling that county for 10 years. He wanted that land before the water find, and he definitely wants it now. What's he going to do? I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I want to be ahead of it. What do you need to be ahead of it? She had thought about this in the 2 days since the storm. She had a specific answer. I need the ranch to be visible as a functioning, legitimate operation before whatever he's planning gains traction. I want to bring a journalist out here, agricultural press, something that covers specialty livestock and innovative farming, a feature story on the water find and the heritage breed program. Martin was quiet for a moment. That's not a bad idea. It makes us public. It makes what we're doing a matter of record. It makes it harder for anyone to quietly pressure suppliers or county offices without it looking like what it is. You've thought this through. I've been awake a lot since Friday. Martin almost laughed. I'll make a call to Western Agricultural Quarterly. They owe me a conversation. No promises, but I know the editor. That's all I'm asking for. She hung up and went out to help Tom with the greenhouse frame assessment, because the calls were done and the physical work was still there, and it wasn't going to do itself. The greenhouse frame was more repairable than she'd feared. Tom had been a welder before he was a ranch hand, something she hadn't known until he looked at the bent steel structure and said, matter-of-factly, that he could fix it in a day and a half if she could get him the materials. She got him the materials by the end of the day. He fixed it in a day and 3/4, which he offered as an apology. She told him it was excellent work, which it was. They replanted the greenhouse in the 3rd week of May. It was later than she'd wanted and earlier than she'd feared, which she decided to count as acceptable. The Henders Brothers crew fixed the barn roof in 2 days at a cost that was painful but not catastrophic. The tractor was repaired by a mechanic from Larkspur named Vic, who charged too much and took 3 days but did good work. The fence sections were rebuilt by Caleb and Tom over a long weekend with Danny helping despite his injured knee, which Eliza told him repeatedly to rest, and which he repeatedly did not. The ranch looked, by the end of May, like a place that had taken a blow and was still standing, which was exactly what it was. It was in the 1st week of June that the first sign of what Roy Becker was actually planning revealed itself, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Sandra Voss from the County Agricultural Extension Office called on a Tuesday afternoon with an apologetic quality in her voice that immediately told Eliza the call was not good news. "There's been a challenge to your specialty grain permit," Sandra said, "filed last Friday. I wanted to let you know before you heard it another way." Eliza sat down. "On what grounds?" "Water usage." Sandra's voice was careful. "The challenge claims that your proposed irrigation draw from the aquifer will negatively impact downstream water rights held by adjacent properties. It's a fairly standard challenge format, but..." She paused. "It's been filed through a law firm in Billings that I've seen before. They do land acquisition work." Eliza knew without asking what firm it was. She asked anyway. "Croft & Associates," Sandra said. Croft & Associates had a principal named Daniel Croft who appeared, when she looked him up that evening, in a list of attorneys associated with 3 separate Roy Becker land acquisition transactions over the past 8 years. She found this in 40 minutes of online research using the county recorder's public filings and a legal database she accessed through a library card she'd gotten in Larkspur 2 weeks after arriving in Montana, because she had believed from the beginning in being prepared for things before they happened. She was not entirely surprised. She was angry, which was different from surprised. She printed what she'd found and put it in a folder and went to find Caleb. He was in the equipment barn checking the repaired tractor when she walked in. She handed him the folder. He read it standing up, the way he read most things, slowly and with his whole attention. When he finished, he looked up at her. "He's going after the permit," he said, "through a water rights challenge, which is clever because it's technically legitimate and it'll hold up the permit review for at least 60 days while the county assesses it. 60 days pushes us past the optimal planting window for the specialty grain. So the storm bought him time, and now he's using it. That's what I think." Caleb closed the folder. She watched him process it, watched the anger move through him and settle into something more useful, which she recognized as the pattern of a man learning to respond instead of react. "What do we do?" "We fight the challenge," she said, "but we need a water rights attorney, and we need one fast. And we need to counter the claim about downstream impact, which means we need Ruth Cantor to prepare a formal hydrological assessment of the aquifer draw rates and the downstream effect." She paused. "And I think we should call the other property owners who might be affected by Becker's long-term expansion. If he's doing this to us, he's had intentions about other properties in this county, and there may be people who would rather stand with us than wait to be next." Caleb looked at her. "You want to build a coalition," he said. "I want to build a coalition," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "My father had friends out here, people who went back years. Some of them might listen." "I was hoping you'd say that." "There's a man named Earl Hutchins, east of here, about 12 miles. He turned down Becker 2 years ago, and the Mabry family, they've got a spread south of town that..." He stopped. "You've already thought about this, haven't you? You already have a list." She pulled a piece of paper from her jacket pocket. He took it. He looked at the names on it. Several of them he recognized immediately, a few she'd found through county records that he confirmed, 2 that surprised him. "The Reinhold operation," he said. "They've been quiet." "They've been quiet because no one's asked them to be loud," she said. "There's a difference." He handed the paper back. He looked at her with that expression she'd been watching develop for months. Not just trust, which was still fragile, but something like partnership. The specific look of a person who has stopped calculating whether to believe in someone and started simply acting on the assumption that they do. "When do we start making calls?" he said. "Tonight," she said. "You make the calls. I'll be at the table with the files." She paused. They need to hear your voice. It's your family's land. Our land, he said. It was the first time he'd said it that way. She didn't make a thing of it, but she felt it, the way you feel a door opening in a house you'd been told was closed. Our land, she agreed. Tonight, then. She went back to the house to set up the kitchen table with every document she'd compiled, because the calls were one thing and the follow-up was another, and there was a significant amount of work between here and whatever was coming next, and she had never once in her life been the kind of person who waited for the work to come to her. Outside, the north field sat under the June sun, green in a way it hadn't been green before the irrigation lines went in, and the sheep moved through the east pasture in their small particular way. And somewhere below all of it, the water moved through the limestone in the dark, steady, and uninterrupted, as if it had simply been waiting all along for someone to understand what it was worth. Caleb made 7 calls that first night, and Eliza sat at the kitchen table with the files and listened to his end of each conversation, which told her more about the county's social architecture than 3 months of her own research had managed to do. The calls followed a pattern. He'd open with the storm. Everyone had been hit by it. Everyone had damage to compare. And from there, he'd move to the water rights challenge, which he described plainly without editorializing, because Caleb Whitmore was not a man who dressed things up, and the people he was calling would have smelled embellishment from 12 miles away. Then he'd ask a question, not, "Will you help us?" Just, "What do you know about Croft and Associates?" The answers came back faster than she'd expected. Earl Hutchins had received a letter from Croft and Associates in February, 2 months before the Whitmore water find was even public knowledge. The letter had been vague, something about regional water usage assessments, and Earl had set it aside and mostly forgotten about it. He hadn't connected it to Becker until Caleb said the name. The Mabry family, father and 2 adult sons, had been approached by Becker directly in March, after the drilling crew had already come and gone from the Whitmore North Field. The offer had been framed as neighborly, and the price had been, as Eliza had learned to expect, fair enough to seem reasonable and low enough to sting on reflection. They'd declined. They hadn't known they were in company. 2 other properties had received variations on the same letter Earl had gotten. 1 family had responded to it. Eliza felt the air go slightly thinner when Caleb relayed that information, because a family that had responded to Croft and Associates' letters was a family that might already be partway into a process they didn't fully understand. By 10 o'clock, Caleb had confirmed 5 properties whose owners were willing to talk further. He'd left messages at 2 more. 1 call had gone badly. A man named Sherwood, who didn't trust anything that came from the Whitmore name and said so without softening it, which Caleb absorbed with the specific flatness of a man accustomed to other men's grievances and uncertain of their origins. He came to the kitchen table and sat down and looked at the files without seeing them for a moment. "Sherwood's father and my father had a boundary dispute in the 90s, he said. Went on for 4 years. Who won? Nobody. They split the disputed section and both of them were angry about it until the day they died." He paused. "Sherwood's going to be a problem. Is his property adjacent to yours?" "East boundary." She found the county map she'd printed and located the Sherwood property. It sat between the Whitmore eastern fence line and the Mabry spread, which meant if Becker wanted a contiguous land mass, and men like Roy Becker always wanted contiguous land masses, the Sherwood property was a piece he'd need. "Sherwood might come around on his own when he realizes he's also a target," she said, "or he'll sell to Becker to spite us." She looked at the map. "Then we have to make sure he understands what he's selling into before he decides." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. He was tired in the compound way that comes from physical exhaustion stacked on top of mental effort, and she could see the weight of the week in how he was holding himself. Slightly forward, slightly compressed, like a man bracing against wind that hadn't stopped yet. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you. I'm going to finish the filing summary for the water rights attorney. It'll take another hour. It's almost 11. The attorney's consultation is Thursday morning," she said. "I want the documentation complete before then." She looked at him. "You've done good work tonight. Those calls, the way you talked to those people, that was the right way." He looked at her with a slightly uncertain quality, like a compliment was a thing he didn't have reliable muscle memory for receiving. "Get some sleep, Caleb," she said. He went. She worked for another hour and 40 minutes, and then she went to sleep as well, and the ranch was quiet around her in the way it had become familiar. The particular silence of a working property at night, animals settling, wind against the walls, the distant sound of a fence wire ticking in the cooling air. The water rights attorney's name was Grace Adeyemi, and she practiced out of Billings and came recommended by two separate sources. Martin Feld's lawyer Howard Brent, who had said she was the best in the state at this kind of challenge, and Ruth Cantor, who had worked with her on a different aquifer dispute 3 years prior and described her simply as someone who didn't lose. She drove out Thursday morning in a sensible car and wore clothes that were professional without being theatrical, and took notes by hand in a notebook with a dark green cover. She was 47, precise, and had the particular quality of a person who had heard every version of every story before and was interested only in the specific facts of yours. Eliza laid out the documentation in the order she'd prepared it. The hydrological assessment, the well testing results, Ruth Cantor's analysis, the permit application and timeline, the challenge filing, the connection between Croft and Associates and Becker's previous land acquisitions, and the letters received by Earl Hutchins and the other neighboring properties. Grace read through all of it without speaking. This took 22 minutes. Caleb sat at the kitchen table and drank 2 cups of coffee and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. When Grace finished, she looked up and said, "The challenge is defensible. Your hydrological data is strong. The downstream impact claim is going to fall apart the moment Ruth Cantor presents a formal draw rate analysis, because the aquifer volume and the fracture system geometry don't support the claim that your usage affects downstream rights at the draw rate you're proposing." "How long to counter it?" Eliza asked. 6 to 8 weeks to get a hearing date. Another 4 to 6 at the hearing itself, depending on the county reviewer. Grace tapped her pen on her notebook. "What concerns me more is the pattern. The letters to the neighboring properties aren't legally actionable on their own, but they suggest a coordinated strategy, and coordinated strategies tend to have more components than the ones you've already seen." She looked at Eliza. "What haven't you seen yet?" Eliza had been asking herself the same question for 4 days. "I don't know. That's what worries me." "Is there anything on this property that creates a regulatory exposure? Any outstanding compliance issues, permits that were filed but not finalized, easements that haven't been properly recorded?" Caleb and Eliza looked at each other. "The eastern easement," Caleb said. Eliza hadn't heard about an eastern easement. She looked at him. "There's a utility easement along the eastern boundary," he said slowly. "My father recorded it in 2009 to allow a power line access. The power company never used it. It should have been vacated when the line was rerouted, but I don't think—" He stopped. "I don't think my father ever filed the vacation." Grace wrote something in her notebook. "If that easement is still on record, it creates a cloud on the title that could be used to complicate any further property transactions or development permits. It's not a legal weapon in itself, but in the right hands, it's a tool for delay." "Croft and Associates," Eliza said. "Would be my guess," Grace said. "You need to find the original easement documentation and file a vacation order as quickly as possible. County Recorder's Office, it's administrative, but it needs to happen before anyone else notices it's still there." "How quickly?" "Yesterday," Grace said, without inflection. The original easement documentation was in a box in the attic above the equipment barn. Harold Whitmore had been, whatever his financial failings, a meticulous keeper of paper records, and the boxes were organized by year in a system that was perfectly logical once you understood it, which Eliza did after about 40 minutes of examination. She found the 2009 easement filing and the power company's 2013 letter confirming the reroute, which was exactly what was needed to support the vacation order. She and Caleb drove to the county recorder's office in Larkspur on Friday morning and filed the vacation order themselves, and the clerk, a woman in her 60s named Pat, who had known Harold Whitmore for 20 years, and who looked at Eliza with the frank appraisal of someone who had heard the town's various opinions and was forming her own, processed the paperwork with an efficiency that Eliza took as a form of quiet endorsement. On the way back from the recorder's office, Caleb said, "How did you know to ask Grace about easements?" "I didn't. She asked about regulatory exposures and you remembered it. But you knew what it meant when I said it." "I read the county property code last month," she said. "Easement vacation procedures are in Chapter 12. He drove for a moment without speaking. Outside the truck windows, the Montana landscape moved past in its enormous, indifferent way. Sky and grass and the occasional structure that looked like it had been placed there by accident and then decided to stay. You read the county property code, he said. There were gaps in what I knew, she said. I don't like gaps. Another silence. Eliza. She looked at him. I owe you an apology, he said. He said it looking at the road, which she suspected was the only way he could say it. From the beginning, from the courthouse, I made a judgment about you that was, he stopped. It wasn't right, and it wasn't fair, and I want to say that plainly. She looked at the road too. Outside, a hawk was working a thermal above a fence line, circling in slow, efficient loops. You were grieving, she said. That's not an excuse. No, but it's context. She paused. I didn't come here expecting to be welcomed. I came here because I needed something different, and this place needed something I had. That was the arrangement. She paused again. What it's become is something else. Something better, I think. He nodded. It was a slow nod, the kind that means more than agreement. I think so too, he said. They drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was by now entirely comfortable. The journalist from Western Agricultural Quarterly arrived the following Tuesday. His name was Paul Renner, and he was in his early 50s, lanky and slightly disheveled in the way that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors or in document archives and not much time in front of mirrors. He had a camera that he used constantly, and a recorder that he ran throughout the visit, and a habit of asking follow-up questions at unexpected moments, which Eliza had been told to expect, and which she found she didn't mind because his follow-up questions were good ones. Martin Feld's editor contact had delivered more than a conversation. Paul Renner was not there to write a brief item. He was writing a feature piece, 4 to 6 pages in the quarterly's next issue, on what he described as a new wave of diversified small ranch operations in the Mountain West that were finding sustainability through innovation. The Whitmore Ranch was, he said, a particularly interesting case because of the water find and the combination of heritage livestock with specialty crop development. He spent 3 hours with Eliza in the North Field, walking the irrigation infrastructure and asking detailed questions about the aquifer draw system. He spent an hour with Ruth Cantor on the phone, which Eliza arranged on site. He spent 90 minutes with Caleb in the equipment barn looking at the operation from the historical side. Harold's founding vision, the generational inheritance, the specific challenge of maintaining a family property through economic shifts that had nothing to do with the quality of the land or the people working it. Eliza sat in on the conversation with Caleb and said nothing, which was deliberate. She wanted Paul Renner to understand that this was Caleb's land and Caleb's family and Caleb's story, and that what she had done was done in the service of that, not in replacement of it. She thought Caleb understood what she was doing. He glanced at her once, about halfway through, with an expression that confirmed it. At the end of the day, Paul Renner stood in the yard and looked at the property in the late afternoon light and said, "What would you say to people who are watching operations like yours fail and wondering if there's another way?" He was asking Caleb. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the north field, at the sheep in the east pasture, at the barn with its new roof corner catching the sun. "I'd say don't confuse the way it's always been done with the only way it can be done," he said. "My father built this place around cattle, and that was right for his time. Holding on to his methods when the time had changed, that's where it went wrong. Not the land, not the cattle. The method." Paul Renner wrote that down. Then he looked at Eliza. "And you?" She thought for a moment. "I'd say look at what the land is actually telling you. Not what you want it to be, not what it used to be, what it is." She paused. "Most land that looks like it's failing has something in it that hasn't been found yet." He wrote that down too. The article ran 5 weeks later, which was faster than Paul Renner's usual timeline because his editor had pushed it to the front of the next issue. And when Eliza held the printed copy in her hands in the kitchen, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the specific satisfaction of a plan that had worked exactly as intended, which was rare enough that she gave herself 2 full minutes to simply feel it before moving on. The article was 3 pages and contained 2 photographs, one of the north field with the irrigation infrastructure visible, one of Caleb and Eliza standing at the fence line with the sheep pasture behind them. In the photograph, she looked solidly herself, large and dark-haired and not particularly photogenic, and entirely present. She studied the image for a moment and then set the magazine down. It was the calls that followed the article's publication that she hadn't entirely predicted, though in retrospect she should have. The first call came from a specialty wool buyer in Portland who had seen the piece shared by a colleague and wanted to know about their churro clip timeline. The second came from a grain distributor in Seattle who was specifically seeking Montana-sourced specialty grain for a Pacific Northwest natural foods contract. The third came from another rancher in Wyoming who had read the article and wanted to talk about the Heritage Breed Program and whether they'd considered a cooperative purchasing arrangement for breeding stock. These were good calls. She took them and passed two of them to Caleb and handled one herself and started a call log because there would be more and they needed a system. The less welcome call came from Howard Brent, Martin Feld's lawyer, on a Friday afternoon. "I'm calling as a courtesy," Howard said, which was how lawyers announced that the information they were about to deliver was not good. "We've become aware that Croft and Associates has filed a secondary challenge. This one is to your agricultural partnership agreement with Mr. Feld." Eliza sat down. "On what grounds?" "They're claiming a procedural irregularity in the way the partnership was recorded with the county. Specifically that the revenue share arrangement constitutes an undisclosed encumbrance on the property title that should have been recorded separately at the time of the lien resolution." Howard paused. "It's a thin argument, but thin arguments filed through the right channels in the right county can hold things up for a considerable amount of time." "How much time?" "If they get the hearing they're requesting, and if the county reviewer is sympathetic, 6 months, possibly more." 6 months. She ran the math automatically, the way she always did. 6 months pushed the specialty grain revenue into the following year. 6 months of legal fees, which they were not positioned to absorb easily. 6 months of Martin Feld's partnership capital tied up in a challenged agreement, which might or might not cause Martin to reconsider his involvement regardless of his previous patience. "Martin's position?" she asked. "He's holding," Howard said. "He's frustrated, but he's holding. He wanted me to tell you that specifically." "Tell him I'm grateful." "There's something else." Howard paused with the particular weight of a lawyer preparing to say something he doesn't enjoy saying. "In researching the secondary challenge, I found a connection I want you to be aware of. The county reviewer who's been assigned to the water rights challenge is a man named Carl Pettis. Carl Pettis was, until 18 months ago, a partner in a land management firm that did consulting work for Becker Consolidated. The room was very quiet. "He's no longer affiliated," Howard continued. "He disclosed the prior relationship when he took the county position, but the disclosure was recorded without triggering a recusal requirement because the time gap was sufficient under county ethics standards." A pause. "Whether that's appropriate or not is a question, but it's not currently an actionable one." She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she opened them. "Thank you, Howard," she said. "Eliza." His voice shifted slightly, became less formal. "I want to say, I came into this thing thinking you were a secondary party. I know that's not—" "Howard." "Yes." "What can we do about Pettis?" A pause. "Nothing directly. But if Grace Adeyemi is filing the water rights counter-challenge, she can request that the hearing be conducted at the state level rather than the county level, citing the complexity of the aquifer data. That would move it out of Pettis's jurisdiction entirely. It's a longer process, but a cleaner one. I'll call Grace today." "I thought you would," he said. She called Grace immediately after hanging up, and Grace said she'd been looking at the same option and would file the state-level request by end of week. Then Eliza sat in her small office for a moment and thought about Roy Becker with a clarity that had moved past anger into something more useful, a cold, precise understanding of the full shape of what he was doing. He wasn't trying to force a sale. Not directly. He was trying to exhaust them. He was filing challenges and creating delays and tying up capital and legal attention because he understood, correctly, that a ranch in their position couldn't sustain indefinite friction. He didn't need to win every battle. He just needed them to run out of energy. She thought, he doesn't know what I'm made of. Then she thought, he's going to find out. She got up and went to find Caleb. She told him everything. She had made a practice of this from the first weeks, not softening the bad information, not delaying it until she had a solution ready to offer alongside it. He had earned the information unfiltered. He always processed it better than she initially expected him to, and he was processing it better now than he would have 3 months ago. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to stop," Caleb said. "No. So we either outlast him, or we find something that stops him." "Yes." Do we have something that stops him? She had been thinking about this since Howard's call. Maybe. I want to talk to Earl Hutchins and the other property owners again. The letters they received from Croft and Associates. If those letters constitute a coordinated pattern of interference with property rights, there may be a basis for a joint complaint to the state attorney general's office. It's a long shot, and it would need a lawyer who does that kind of work, but it changes the public picture, Caleb said. It changes the public picture significantly. Right now, Becker is making a series of individual moves that each look like standard business. A complaint to the AG's office makes the pattern visible as a pattern. Caleb thought for a moment. Earl Hutchins will do it. The Mabrys will do it. The family that responded to Croft's letter. They're not going to want their name on a complaint. No, but we don't need them. We need enough signatures to establish a pattern. She paused. There may be properties further back, transactions from 4 or 5 years ago where Croft was involved. If we can find owners from those who felt pressured, it makes the complaint stronger. County recorder's records are public, Caleb said. They are. He looked at her. You've already started looking. I found 3 transactions from 2019 and 2020 where Croft and Associates appeared in the title chain, she said. I have the names. I don't know yet if those families would talk to us. Let me make the calls, Caleb said. I know 2 of those families. She handed him the list. He took it. He looked at it. Then he looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his working face. Not warm exactly, but engaged, committed, aimed at the problem rather than the weight of it. When did you pull these records? He asked. Last night. You were up again. I told you it keeps me up at night. He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. When this is over, he said, I want you to sleep for a week. It was not a tender statement. It was the statement of a man who had been watching someone work without ceasing and had finally found a way to say he noticed. For Caleb Whitmore, it was the equivalent of a great deal. She felt something shift in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. Not yet. When this is over, she said, I'll sleep for 2. The calls to the 2019 and 2020 property families took 3 evenings and yielded 2 families willing to discuss their experiences with Croft and Associates, both of whom described a pattern of procedural complications that had appeared in their county permitting processes around the same time as their contact with the firm. One family had ultimately sold, not to Becker directly, but to a holding company that subsequent research showed was connected to Becker Consolidated through a subsidiary structure. The other family had held their property, but the experience had left them with a specific bitterness that made them willing to talk. The attorney who could handle an AG complaint, according to Grace Adeyemi, was a woman in Helena named Patricia Cross, who specialized in property rights litigation and who agreed to a consultation after reviewing the summary Eliza prepared. Patricia Cross's assessment, delivered in a 40-minute phone call, was that the pattern was real, the documentation was reasonably strong, and a complaint was viable, not guaranteed of success, but viable, which was more than Eliza had let herself hope for. What's the timeline, Tut? Eliza asked. Complaint preparation, 4 to 6 weeks. Filing. The AG's office will conduct a preliminary review, 60 to 90 days. If they find sufficient basis to investigate, that changes the landscape for Becker considerably. And if they don't? Then you've spent 4 to 6 weeks on preparation and filing fees, and you're in the same position you're in now, minus time and some money. Patricia was direct about it. But I think they'll find sufficient basis. The subsidiary structure on the 2020 sale is particularly interesting. The 4 families who agreed to be part of the complaint met on a Saturday morning in the parking lot of the Larkspur grain elevator, which was the most neutral location Caleb could suggest that had enough space for 4 trucks and wasn't anyone's property. Eliza stood with Caleb at the tailgate of their truck and watched Earl Hutchins shake hands with the 2 Mabry sons, and felt the weight of the morning, the specific gravity of people who had each been alone with a problem, discovering that they were not alone with it. Earl was 68, silver-haired, and had the direct gaze of a man who had been a rancher long enough to have no patience for anything decorative. He shook Caleb's hand and then looked at Eliza with a measuring quality. You're the one who found the water, he said. The hydrologist found it, she said. You're the one who thought to look. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and equal, and she understood it as acceptance. which Earl Hutchins did not dispense carelessly. The conversation that followed was practical and frank, the way conversations are when farmers talk about money and land. The two things they never discuss abstractly because there's nothing abstract about them. Earl described his letter from Croft and Associates in detail. The Mabrys described their encounter with Becker directly. The two families from the 2019 and 2020 transactions spoke about what had happened to them with a specificity that put the pattern into shape. By the end of the morning, all four families had agreed to the AG complaint. Driving home, Caleb was quiet for long enough that Eliza glanced at him. "What?" she said. "I've known Earl Hutchins my whole life," he said. "He never shook my father's hand like that." "Like what?" "Like an equal." He paused. "He shook yours first." She looked at the road. "Earl Hutchins shakes hands with people who've done something worth shaking hands about. It's not complicated." Caleb was quiet for another mile. "No," he said. "I guess it's not." The complaint was filed with the State Attorney General's office on a Thursday in late July. Patricia Cross filed it with the documentation Eliza had compiled and the statements from all four participating families and a chain of evidence analysis of the Croft and Associates transactions going back 5 years that Patricia described as the clearest pattern she'd seen in this type of case. The day after the filing, Roy Becker called the ranch line. Eliza answered. There was a pause when he heard her voice, brief, recovered quickly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand there's been a complaint filed." "That's accurate," she said. "That's a significant step." His voice was still pleasant, but the calibration had changed. She could hear it. The warmth was thinner. Something harder was closer to the surface. "I want you to understand that I've operated in this county for 30 years with a clean record. I'm sure the Attorney General's office will take that into account," she said. A brief silence. "What is it you actually want?" he asked. And this time the pleasantness was gone entirely, and what was there instead was the voice of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and was trying to understand what currency he was being asked to pay in. She had thought about how to answer this question. She'd known it was coming. "I want your water rights challenge withdrawn," she said, "and the secondary challenge to the partnership agreement, both of them, in writing through Croft and Associates by end of next week." Silence. "And if I do that," he said, "the participating families in the AG complaint will have no further information to provide if the AG's office reaches out for additional context." It was not a threat. It was a description of a situation, accurate and precise. And Roy Becker was a man who dealt in accurate and precise descriptions of situations and understood exactly what she was saying. "You'd need to speak for the other families," he said. "I'd need to consult with them," she said, "but I believe I can." Another silence, longer this time. "I'll have Croft contact you," he said. She held the phone for a moment after he hung up. Then she set it down carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady and you don't want anyone to notice. She went to the kitchen window. The North Field was doing what it had been doing all summer, growing, quietly and without drama, in the way that well-irrigated land grows when you've given it what it needed. The sheep were visible in the east pasture. Danny was fixing a gate near the south fence, and she could see Tom moving equipment near the barn, and the whole property had the look and sound of something that was working. She heard boots in the hall. Caleb came into the kitchen and looked at her face and understood immediately that something had happened. She told him. He stood at the table and listened with his hands flat on the surface the way he had that very first night, but everything else was different. The tension in him different, the quality of his silence different. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment. "He's going to withdraw," Caleb said. "I think so, yes." "Because of the AG complaint." "Because of the AG complaint and because Patricia Cross is good and because the pattern is real and documented and he knows it," she paused, "and because the article ran. He's a businessman. He doesn't want the story to become large operation pressures, small family ranch after major water find. That's not a story that ends well for him." Caleb nodded slowly. He looked around the kitchen, at the organized counter, at the files in the small office off to the side, at the coffee can that was still on top of the refrigerator because she'd left it there on purpose, a small reminder of what the first night had looked like. "When I threw those papers across the table," he said. She waited. "I thought you'd sign them and stay out of my way." He said it without looking away, which cost him something. "I thought you'd be... I don't know what I thought." You thought I'd be a problem you could manage, she said. Yeah. A pause. I was wrong about what kind of problem you'd be. She looked at him. He was a complicated man who had inherited complicated things and carried them in the complicated way that people do when they don't have anyone to put them down with. She had walked into his life without being wanted and had refused, stubbornly and consistently, to be what he'd expected. She thought she would not have done it differently. The churro clip comes in September, she said. I've confirmed the Portland buyer. And the grain. The late planting is going to produce less than projected, but the quality testing results came back last week, and the quality is high enough that the Seattle distributor is prepared to pay above market rate for what we have. Caleb almost smiled. The almost was important. It was the distance he still had to travel, and she didn't want to rush it. You're doing it again, he said. What? Thinking 6 steps ahead. Someone has to, she said. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window the way it came through in summer, full and direct and generous. And she stood in it without moving, solid and present and not. For the first time in her life, the least bit apologetic about the amount of space she occupied in it. Thank you, he said, for all of it. She nodded. Now, she said, I need you to go talk to Tom about the irrigation schedule for the North Field, because the timing matters, and I can't be in 2 places at once. He went. She turned back to the window and let herself have 30 seconds of something close to peace before she picked up the phone to call Earl Hutchins, because there was still work to do and Roy Becker's withdrawal wasn't confirmed yet, and the wool buyer in Portland had a scheduling question she hadn't answered, and the ranch was still running, still building, still becoming what she had seen in it from the very first day. 30 seconds. Then she dialed. Roy Becker's withdrawal came in writing on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after the phone call. Eliza held the letter from Croft and Associates in the kitchen and read it twice. It was formal and bloodless and said nothing about why, which was exactly the language of a man who was retreating without admitting he was retreating. Both challenges, the water rights filing and the secondary challenge to the partnership agreement, were withdrawn effective immediately. No explanation offered, no apology extended, just the clean clinical language of legal disengagement, signed by Daniel Croft in a handwriting that was small and precise and told her nothing about the man except that he was careful. She set the letter on the kitchen table. She had imagined this moment, in the way you imagine things when you're working toward them in the dark, and you can't see the end, but you keep moving anyway. She had imagined feeling something large and complete. Relief, maybe, or triumph. Something with a clean shape to it. What she actually felt was tired. Deeply, specifically tired. The kind that lives below the muscles in a place that sleep alone can't reach. And underneath the tiredness, something quieter. A satisfaction that wasn't celebration, more like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten what your hands felt like without it. She called Patricia Cross first, then Grace Adeyemi, then Martin Feld. Martin said good, and then asked about the Q3 grain numbers, which was exactly the response she'd expected, and which made her feel, unreasonably, like laughing. Earl Hutchins said, well, I'll be damned, in a tone that contained multitudes. She didn't call Roy Becker sad. Caleb found out when he came in for lunch and saw the letter on the table. He picked it up and read it standing, the way he read everything, and she watched his face move through the information in real time. The brief tightening, then something releasing, then the specific stillness of a man recalibrating. He set the letter down. It's over, he said. The challenge is over, she said. The ranch isn't over. There's still a lot of work. I know that. He sat down. I just meant, I know what you meant. She sat across from him. Yes, that part is over. They sat together in the kitchen in the middle of the day with the letter between them and the September light coming through the window and the sound of Tom moving equipment somewhere outside. And Caleb looked at the table and then at her and said, my father would not have believed this. Which part? Any of it. He paused. The water, the sheep, the grain. Another pause, longer. You. She held his gaze. He left you a letter, by the way, she said. Caleb's face changed completely. What? In the boxes from the attic. I found it when I was looking for the easement documentation. It was in an envelope with your name on it. She stood and went to the small office and came back with the envelope and set it on the table in front of him. I didn't open it. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. His name was written on the front in Harold's careful hand, the same hand she'd seen in the letters and documents and financial records, the same measured pressure, the same slightly formal letter formation of a man who'd been taught penmanship when that still meant something. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. "I didn't know when to give it to you. I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I realized there probably wasn't a right moment. There was just a moment." He picked up the envelope. "I'll give you some time," she said, and started to stand. "Stay," he said. She stayed. He opened the envelope carefully, the way you open something when you're not sure you're ready for what's inside. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, and he read it with the stillness of a person who is trying very hard not to let their face show what they're reading. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands. She did not look at him. When he finished, he folded the pages and put them back in the envelope and set it on the table with the same care he'd used to open it. She waited. "He knew," Caleb said. His voice was different, rougher at the edges. He knew how bad it was. The finances. He knew he'd borrowed too much and the herd losses had broken the math, and he stopped. He said he was sorry. He said he was ashamed he couldn't fix it before he... Another stop. He said the arrangement with the broker, the marriage arrangement, wasn't because he thought I couldn't manage alone. It was because he'd been watching me manage alone for 4 years, and he was scared of what alone was doing to me. Eliza said nothing. He said... Caleb pressed the heel of his hand to his jaw for a moment, briefly. He said he hoped I'd be smart enough to let whoever came in actually help. He said that was always my problem, that I'd rather lose something than ask for help with it. The kitchen was very quiet. He was right, Caleb said. He was a father who knew his son, Eliza said. That's not a small thing. Caleb looked at the envelope. He looked like a man standing in the aftermath of something, not destroyed, but rearranged, shifted at the foundation in a way that would change the shape of everything built on top of it. He never met you, he said. No. He would have liked you. She felt that land in her chest in a place she hadn't known was open to being reached. She had lost her own parents young and had spent a long time learning not to notice the specific absence of people who might have seen her clearly. Harold Whitmore, in 2 pages of careful handwriting, had seen her before she arrived, had built a space for her in something he couldn't stay to witness, and the weight of that was more than she had room for right now. Eat something, she said, because it was the only thing she trusted herself to say. Tom needs you at the barn at 2. He looked at her. He understood what she was doing, and he let her do it. All right, he said. Oh. The first churro wool clip came in the 3rd week of September. Carla Ostroff drove up from Wyoming again for the shearing, which Eliza hadn't asked for and which Carla explained simply as wanting to see how her animals were doing. She supervised the shearing with the critical attention of someone who was assessing a year's worth of care in a single morning. And by the end she had said almost nothing, and her expression had shifted from assessment to something that Eliza would have described as satisfied if Carla had been a person who showed satisfaction easily. They're in better condition than when I left them, Carla said. Danny takes it personally, Eliza said. They both looked at Danny, who was at the far end of the shearing area talking to one of the sheep the way a person talks to an animal they've named and will never admit to loving. He's named all of them, Carla said. I know. I gave up discouraging it 2 months ago. Smart, Carla said. Animals that are named get better care. It's not sentimental, it's practical. She paused. Your operation here is good. What you've built in a year is genuinely good. Coming from Carla Ostroff, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation and a medal. Eliza received it with a nod and kept her expression steady because she was in public and Danny was nearby, and she had a reputation for equanimity that she was not going to undermine over a wool clip, however good the clip was. The Portland buyer drove out himself to inspect before confirming the contract. His name was James Whitfield, and he was precise about fiber diameter and yield weight and asked technical questions that she answered with the confidence of a person who had spent the better part of a year learning a thing she'd known nothing about when she started. And there was something in that. The gap between who she'd been when she arrived and who she was now, standing in a shearing shed talking fiber diameter with a Portland wool buyer. that she couldn't look at directly without feeling something she had no good word for. James Whitfield confirmed the contract at a price that was above the baseline she'd quoted Martin Feld in the original projections. She allowed herself, driving back to the house after the contract signing, approximately 1 mile of feeling genuinely, straightforwardly happy about it. Then she started thinking about the next year's clip and the breeding program and whether it was too early to explore a second heritage breed edition, and the happiness folded itself into the work the way it always did, which was not a loss. She had decided long ago, but just the particular shape her joy took. The specialty grain harvest happened in October, 6 weeks behind her original schedule, and it was smaller than she'd planned, 40% below the initial projection, which she had been honest with Martin Feld about from the moment the late planting had become inevitable. What she had not been able to fully predict was the quality. The Seattle distributor's lab results came back the first week of October, and the fiber content, protein levels, and overall quality metrics put the Whitmore grain in the top 15% of the specialty category nationally. The price per bushel that the distributor offered was 32% above what she'd projected in the partnership agreement. The math, once she ran it, produced a number that made her sit very still at her desk for a moment. The reduced yield plus the premium pricing produced a Q3 revenue figure that was almost exactly what she had originally projected for a full yield at standard pricing. The storm's damage to the timeline had been compensated, improbably, by the quality effect of the late-season growing conditions on the grain's development. She had not planned this. She needed to be clear with herself about that. She had not been smart enough to predict it. She had simply been persistent enough to keep moving after the things she'd planned had fallen apart. And the land had done something she hadn't expected because good land, properly supported, tends to do that. She wrote up the Q3 report for Martin Feld that night. It was the most satisfying document she'd ever prepared, which was a strange thing to be true of a quarterly agricultural revenue report. And she was aware that it was strange, and she didn't care. Martin called her the morning after he received it. "I've been in agricultural investment for 31 years, he said. "I've never had a Q3 report make me want to call someone at 7 in the morning." "I'm glad it was worth the early call," she said. "I want to talk about the partnership structure," he said. "Specifically, I want to discuss what it looks like post the 7-year term. Because what's happening on this property is going to be significantly larger in 7 years than what we agreed on, and I'd like to be part of it in a way that reflects that." She had been waiting for this conversation. She had a position prepared. "I'd be open to discussing a long-term investment relationship that isn't structured as a revenue share," she said. "I'd rather have a proper equity arrangement at that stage, with full transparency on both sides." "I was thinking the same thing," Martin said. "Then let's talk in January," she said, "when we have the full annual numbers." "January," he agreed. She hung up and looked at the October light through the office window and thought about what Martin Feld's long-term investment interest meant in concrete terms, about what the ranch could become with that kind of capital properly structured, about the additional acreage that the water system could support, about the second breed she'd been thinking about the cooperative purchasing arrangement the Wyoming rancher had proposed, and that she'd been holding in reserve until the immediate crises were resolved. She had been so focused on survival that she had not let herself think about what came after survival. Now, for the first time, she let herself think about it. It was a large thought. It needed room. Tom Niederer knocked on the office door that afternoon. He knocked, which he never did. He usually just appeared in the doorway with whatever he needed to say already formed. The knock meant it was something different. "Come in, Tom." He came in and stood, turning his hat in his hands, the way he had that very first morning when he'd come to tell her he wanted to learn the new things. She waited. "I've got a nephew," he said. "He's 26, agricultural degree from Montana State. He's been doing contract work and he's looking for a permanent position." A pause. "He's good. I wouldn't say so if he wasn't." She thought for a moment. They needed another hand. She'd known it since Pete left, had been managing around the gap with everyone working harder than was sustainable long-term. "Can he start in the new year?" "He can start when you need him." "Send me his information. I'd like to talk to him before we decide." She looked at Tom. "If he's half as solid as you, we're lucky to have him." Tom put his hat back on. He nodded once, with the compactness of a man who doesn't need more acknowledgement than the practical confirmation that he's been heard. "One more thing," he said. "Yes." He looked at her with a directness that was characteristic of him, but with something in it she hadn't seen before. When I came to you that first morning, you could have told me to talk to Caleb. I could have, she said. You didn't. No. He nodded again. Appreciate that, he said, and left. She looked at the empty doorway for a moment after he went. She thought about all the small decisions that had built the thing around her. The choice not to sign the papers that first night. The choice to go out into the storm-dark field with the rope. The choice to sit at the kitchen table with the unopened mail and not look away from what it said. None of them had been large decisions in the moment. None of them had felt like turning points when she was making them. They had just been the next thing, and then the next thing after that. And the accumulation of next things had become this. A working ranch, a functioning life, a man who had set our land without seeming to notice what he'd said. She picked up her pen and went back to work. The night the bank called to confirm that the first lien on the property had been fully resolved, November, the first cold week of it, frost on the grass in the mornings, and the light going thin in the afternoons, the way Montana light does in the approach to winter. Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table with the phone between them and didn't say anything for a long time. The second lien was on a structured payment plan that the Q3 revenue had allowed her to negotiate with the bank directly. Not eliminated yet, but scheduled, controlled, with a clear pathway to resolution by the end of the following year. For the first time since she'd arrived at the Whitmore Ranch and found a box of unopened mail behind a cracked coffee can, the debt on this property had a shape she could see the end of. My father carried this for 4 years, Caleb said. He carried it alone, she said. He looked at her. There it was again. That thing she'd been watching develop in him for the better part of a year, the thing that had started as wariness and moved through reluctant acknowledgement and uncomfortable gratitude, and arrived now at something that had no defensive distance left in it. He was looking at her the way a person looks at someone they have stopped trying to manage their feelings about. I didn't want you here, he said. I know. I want you to know that I know how wrong I was. Not just the practical of it. Not just... He stopped. I mean, I was wrong about you as a person. From the first minute. I looked at you and I decided who you were based on. He made a gesture that was part frustration, part self-reproach. Based on things that had nothing to do with who you actually are. She held his gaze. You were a man who'd been alone for 4 years, and whose father had just died and who was drowning in debt, and who had a stranger arrive at his courthouse and stand next to him for 11 minutes and become his wife. She paused. Your response wasn't kind, but I understood it. You shouldn't have had to understand it. Maybe not, but I did. He was quiet. The frost was forming on the kitchen window in the corners, small crystalline patterns that she'd started to find beautiful, in the particular way you find beautiful the things you've learned to live alongside. Eliza, he said. She waited. I don't want this to be an arrangement anymore. She sat very still. I know that's... He pressed his hands flat on the table. I know that's not a simple thing to say, and I'm not saying it well. But I've been watching you for a year. I've watched you negotiate with Gus Pelletier and hold a calving rope in the mud and read the county property code for fun and sit at this table until 1 in the morning running numbers on problems that weren't even your problems yet. I've watched you be generous with people who weren't generous with you and patient with me when I didn't deserve it, and I've watched you love this land. He stopped. You love this land. Maybe more than I do right now. You saw it for what it could be when all I could see was what it wasn't. She let out a slow breath. And I know what I am, he said. I'm not easy. I know that. I carry things badly. I close off when I should open up. I'm 40 years old and I've spent most of those years being right about things in ways that cost me more than they were worth. He looked at her. But I'd like to try, if you'd let me, to be a real husband to you, not an arrangement. The kitchen was so quiet she could hear the frost. She thought about the courthouse and the papers thrown across the table, and the first night she'd gone out into the dark to find out why a cow sounded wrong. She thought about 9 days of silence and 3 months of wariness and the slow, difficult work of 2 people learning to see each other clearly across a distance that neither of them had built alone. She thought about what it meant to be wanted, not by a system, not by a transaction, not by circumstance, but by a specific person who had seen her work and struggle and fail and persist and had arrived, on the other side of all of it, at a deliberate choice. She had spent a long time not being wanted. She had made peace with it, or thought she had, in the way you make peace with the things you can't change, which is not the same as not feeling them. She looked at Caleb Whitmore across the kitchen table. He was not a simple man, and he was not a finished man, and he would not become either of those things. He would remain difficult in the specific ways he'd always been difficult, and she would remain stubborn in the specific ways she'd always been stubborn, and they would argue about things, and misunderstand each other and get it wrong sometimes in ways that mattered. She knew all of this. She said, "I'd like that too." Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen there before. It was open in a way he didn't usually allow himself to be open, and it was a little frightened, and it was real in the way that only things that cost something are real. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was rough and large and warm, and she turned her hand over and held it. They sat like that in the kitchen while the frost made its patterns on the glass, neither of them saying anything else, because some things don't need more words than the ones that have already been said. The second year of the Whitmore Ranch's new operation was harder than the first in some ways and easier in others. Harder because growth, once it starts, creates its own set of pressures. Tom's nephew Marcus arrived in January and was everything Tom had promised: competent, adaptable, willing to do whatever needed to be done without complaint. And they hired a fourth hand in March, a woman in her 30s named Kezia, who had run a small organic operation in Oregon and brought knowledge of the specialty grain side that filled gaps. Eliza hadn't known she had. The payroll pressure was real. The infrastructure demands were real. Every expansion created 3 new problems for everyone it solved. Easier because she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the debt, which was scheduled and diminishing. Not of Roy Becker, who had gone quiet in a way that had the quality of permanent retirement from that particular interest. She had heard, through Earl Hutchins, that the state attorney general's preliminary review had contacted Becker's operation for documentation, and whatever that process produced had apparently concluded the county was no longer a comfortable operating environment for his land acquisition strategy. Not of the town's opinion, which had shifted in the complicated, incremental way that small-town opinion shifts when results become undeniable. People in Larkspur who had ignored her or looked through her in the first months now stopped to talk. Sandra Voss from the Extension Office became something like a friend. The woman at the county recorder's office, Pat, had started setting aside publications she thought Eliza might find useful. Small things. Accumulations. She did not allow herself to be seduced into thinking it was personal, entirely. Some of it was the ranch's success, and some of it was the Western Agricultural Quarterly article, which had been picked up by 2 national agricultural publications and had generated a quantity of attention that still surprised her when she thought about it. She understood the mechanics of how opinion shifts, and she was not naive about what drove it. But she was also a person who had spent most of her life being dismissed by the kind of people who were now seeking her out, and she allowed herself to find that specific reversal significant. Not as vindication exactly, more as information, as confirmation of something she had always believed but hadn't always been able to hold on to in the dark, at 2 in the morning when the numbers weren't working, that the quality of a thing reveals itself in time, regardless of the first impression it makes. It was Earl Hutchins who first used the word legacy. He said it in the spring of the second year, standing at the fence line between his property and the neighboring spread, with the Whitmore Northfield visible in the distance behind them, green and working and unmistakably alive. "You know what Harold Whitmore wanted this place to be," Earl said. He wasn't talking to her specifically, or not only to her. He was talking in the way old farmers sometimes talk, to the air and the landscape and the general fact of a thing. He wanted it to be something that lasted, something that meant something past his own time. He looked at her. "You gave him that. I don't think he could have dreamed it this exact way, but the thing he wanted is the thing you built." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "He saw something in the arrangement that neither Caleb nor I could see yet." Earl nodded. Harold was like that, looked ahead further than most. A pause. His boy's learning to do the same. She looked at where Caleb was standing further down the fence line, talking to Earl's son about the water system. Caleb was gesturing at the north field with the specific enthusiasm of a man who had begun to understand what he was part of, and she watched him and felt the full weight of the year behind her and the years ahead of her, and the complicated, imperfect, irreplaceable shape of the life she had built in a place where nobody had wanted her. She had not fixed everything. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, even now. The second lien would not be fully resolved until late the following year. Marcus was a good hand, but still learning the operation, and there were gaps. The specialty grain program needed more land to reach the scale that would make it genuinely self-sustaining, and the irrigation system had a section of pipe that Tom had flagged as needing replacement before next spring's planting. There were conversations she and Caleb still hadn't learned how to have without friction, and probably always would have with some friction, because that was the material they were made of, and friction wasn't the same as failure. None of it was finished. None of it was resolved into the clean, simple shape that resolution is supposed to take in the stories people tell about hard times. But it was real, and it was working, and it was hers, theirs, in a way that no document and no financial settlement and no legal arrangement had made it, but that the daily, accumulated choice to stay and see and work and not look away had made it, one morning at a time. The letter from Western Agricultural Quarterly arrived in the second spring, a follow-up inquiry from Paul Renner, who wanted to write a second piece about the Whitmore Ranch's development in the year since the first article. He described it as a story about what happens after the first act, which she thought was the most accurate description she'd heard of what her life actually was. She wrote back and said yes. Paul Renner arrived on a Tuesday in April when the North Field was coming into its second growing season, and the churro flock had produced 11 lambs over the winter, and the specialty grain was in the ground 6 weeks ahead of last year's schedule. He walked the property with her and Caleb for 3 hours, and he asked different questions this time. Not about the mechanics of what they'd built, but about what it felt like to have built it, which was a harder question, and the one she'd known was coming. She thought about how to answer it honestly, in a way that was not a performance. "I think people look at a place like this and they see the result," she said, standing in the north field with the irrigation heads running in the distance. "They see what it became. They don't see the night of the storm, or the phone call from the lawyer, or the morning I sat at a kitchen table with a box of unopened mail and understood that everything was worse than I'd thought." She paused. "What I've learned is that seeing clearly, even when what you see is bad, is the beginning of everything. You can't build anything on the version of reality you wish were true." Paul Renner wrote that down. "And the relationship?" he asked. He glanced at Caleb when he said it. "The marriage. It was arranged. That's an unusual starting point for a partnership." Caleb answered that one. "It was an unusual starting point," he said, "but I've stopped thinking about the starting point. I think about what it is now." He looked at Eliza. "What it is now is the best thing in my life, and I was the last person to understand that it would be." She looked back at him. Paul Renner had enough sensitivity not to write in that moment. He let it be what it was. "There is something I want to say directly, because I have told you this story from the outside, from the careful, observing distance of third person. And I think the story earns something more direct than that at its end. I want to say this: the thing that Eliza Monroe understood, that most people never fully learn, is that the world's judgment of you is always provisional. It is always based on the available evidence, and the available evidence is always incomplete, and the most dangerous thing you can do is accept that judgment as final." She arrived in Montana as a woman nobody wanted. She was too large, too quiet, too unknown, too female to be taken seriously by a town that measured worth in cattle prices and family names, and the specific narrow shape of a ranch woman as they had always imagined one. Every system she walked into had already decided what she was. She refused to become what they had decided, not with confrontation, not with performance, not by demanding to be seen differently before she had given anyone a reason to see her differently. She refused by working, by looking clearly at what was real, by choosing every morning to be the most competent and honest and persistent version of herself available and trusting, not blindly, but with the specific trust of someone who has done the arithmetic, that the truth of a thing eventually becomes visible. It did not happen quickly. It was not clean. There were nights when she sat in that small office and wondered if she had misjudged the water, misjudged Becker, misjudged the grain market, misjudged Caleb. There were mornings when the gap between what she was trying to build and what she currently had felt too large to cross with the tools available to her. She crossed it anyway. This is not a story about a woman who was exceptional in some inborn, effortless way. It is a story about a woman who was willing to be wrong and to keep going, who was willing to not know everything and to learn what she didn't know, who was willing to be disrespected and underestimated and looked through, and to feel all of that, and to work anyway. That is the thing worth keeping from this story. Not the water find, not the AG complaint, not the wool contract or the grain premium. Those are results. Results are the visible end of invisible work. And the invisible work is the only part that matters, the only part you can actually do anything with, because it is the only part that belongs to you regardless of what happens after. Caleb Whitmore threw papers across a table at a woman he'd decided was a burden before she'd said a word. He was wrong about her and right about one thing: she changed everything. She changed it not by being what he expected, but by being entirely what she was, and by refusing, through every version of pressure and dismissal and difficulty that the year produced, to be anything less. She taught him something about vision, not the vision of ambition, not the vision of optimism, but the specific vision of a person who can look at a broken thing and see its actual structure clearly enough to understand where the strength still is. He taught her something too, though it took her longer to name it. He taught her that trust is not a decision you make once, but a practice you maintain, imperfectly and daily, in the space between two people who have chosen to keep choosing each other. They were not perfect. They did not become perfect. The ranch was not perfect. It was a working property, with debt and difficult winters, and equipment that broke at bad times, and a sheep named Henrietta by Danny, who had somehow become the operation's unofficial mascot, and who had opinions about her feed schedule that she expressed loudly and at length. It was real, and it was theirs, and it lasted. 5 years after Eliza Monroe arrived at the Whitmore Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with a suitcase and a head full of numbers and a heart that had learned to expect very little from the world. It was about to walk into. The North Field produced its 5th consecutive specialty grain harvest. Martin Feld's equity stake had been renegotiated at the end of year 3 into a formal agricultural investment partnership that had, by year 5, attracted 2 additional investors and capitalized a land acquisition that expanded the Whitmore operation by 120 acres along the eastern boundary. The Sherwood parcel, as it turned out, purchased not in hostility but in a transaction that Eliza had structured with enough generosity to make Old Man Sherwood feel like he'd won something, which was the only way that deal was ever going to happen. The churro flock stood at 230 animals. Kazia had expanded the specialty grain program into a 3rd variety. Marcus had become the operations manager in everything but title, running the day-to-day of the expanded property with a capability that Tom watched with the specific pride of a man watching his own investment pay out. Danny still named all the sheep. The bank held no liens on the Whitmore property. The 2 notes that had seemed on the day Eliza first read the unopened mail like weights that would pull the ranch under. Both resolved, both paid, both closed. The property was worth, by the assessment of an independent appraiser in year 4, 4 times what it had been worth when Harold Whitmore died. Caleb stood in the North Field on the morning of the 5th grain harvest, before the crew arrived, before the machinery started, in the particular quiet of a Montana morning that has not yet decided to be warm. He stood there with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold, the way his coffee always went cold because he was always looking at something when he should have been drinking it. Eliza came out and stood beside him. "You're thinking about your father," she said. "How do you know?" "You stand differently when you're thinking about him. More still." He looked at her sideways, the corner of his mouth moving. In 5 years, that almost smile had become a real one more often than not, and she had stopped finding it remarkable only because remarkable things, if they persist long enough, become the shape of your ordinary life. He would have walked this field every morning, Caleb said. He did walk it, for years, and never found what was in it. "He found you," she said. "He built this place so you'd have it. What you did with it is yours." "What we did with it." "What we did with it," she agreed. The morning was opening up around them, light finding the tops of the irrigation heads, the sheep audible from the east pasture, the sound of a truck on the road that meant the harvest crew was arriving. Everything that needed to be done was about to need to be done, and the list was long and the day was not getting longer, and she had a call with Martin Feld at 9 and a meeting with Sandra Voss at 11 and 3 weeks of harvest logistics that she had been coordinating since August. She had a full life. the fullest she had ever had. She had built it in a place where nobody wanted her, out of materials that looked like failure to everyone who hadn't looked closely enough, with the specific tools of a woman who had learned that the world's estimation of your worth is just one data point, and not the most reliable one, and that the only estimation that finally matters is the one you make of yourself at 2 in the morning when the numbers aren't working and nobody is watching, and you decide anyway to pick up the pen and keep going. She picked up her own cold coffee and drank it. The harvest crew was pulling through the gate. Caleb raised a hand in greeting. Danny was already out at the sheep pasture, talking to Henrietta about something apparently urgent. Tom was at the equipment barn. Marcus was directing the crew positioning. The north field was green all the way to the fence line. The water was still moving under the limestone, 38 feet down, as it had always moved, as it would move long after everyone who had found it and named it and built a life above it was gone. She had found it because she was looking for what could be right, not what was wrong. That was the whole of it. That was the thing worth keeping. She went to work.